The bell did not ring so much as it seeped into the stone in the deepest hour of the winter night, when the darkness outside the walls of the monastery was absolute, and the air itself felt frozen into a solid block of silence. A single low vibration began in the tower above the dormitory. It was not a loud sound, it was a change in the pressure of the air, a faint metallic hum that travelled down through the joints of the masonry and entered the sleeping ear, not as a call to wake but as a simple, undeniable fact of the hour. The hour was vigils. The time was perhaps 2 hours past midnight. The year was 1378, though no one in the dormitory was thinking of the year. They were thinking only of the cold. You would have felt the cold first in your feet, even through the thickness of 2 woolen blankets, and the coarse weave of the habit you had worn to bed. The chill of the floorboards crept upward. The rushes scattered across the planks did little to stop it. The cold was a patient thing that had been waiting in the corners of the room since Compline the evening before, gathering strength in the long gap when the braziers were extinguished and the breath of 40 sleeping men slowly froze on the beams overhead. Now it was fully awake and waiting for you to emerge from the fragile cocoon of your own warmth. There was a long moment of stillness. In the stalls around you, other shapes under other blankets stirred slowly, a rustle of heavy fabric and a series of soft, muffled coughs as lungs adjusted to air that felt thin and sharp. No one spoke. There was no need for words. The rhythm of the day was older than anyone in the room, and the body knew its part. The figure we will follow for this long, quiet night, and the day that will follow it, is a man named Brother Aldous. He is not young, and he is not old. His beard is touched with grey at the edges, and his hands are stained faintly with a darkness that will never wash out entirely. He is the scribe. In the community he holds a specific and quiet role that grants him small exemptions from the full weight of the divine office, not out of privilege, but out of necessity. The work of the scriptorium required light, and light in winter was a rare and precious commodity that could not be squandered on sleep when the sun was absent. Brother Aldous swung his legs out from under the blanket and placed his bare feet flat on the cold wood. The shock of it was a sharp, clarifying thing that drove the remnants of a vague dream about a garden in summer from his mind. He sat for a count of 10 slow breaths while the bell in the tower above continued its low, steady pulse, a sound that seemed to come from inside the bones of the building rather than from any distinct direction. He reached for his sandals. They were simple leather soles with straps that had been repaired so many times the original shape was only a memory. He did not rush. There was no rushing in the monastery. The day unfolded at the speed of the sun in winter, which is to say, with a grave and dignified slowness. He stood, and the coarse black wool of his habit fell around him, still holding a ghost of warmth from the bed. All around him, the other monks were doing the same. The dormitory was a long, low room with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow. A single oil lamp burned at the far end near the door to the stairwell, and its flame was so small it seemed to be struggling against the immense weight of the dark. It cast a dim orange circle on the floor and left everything else to the imagination. Brother Aldous moved toward it. His footsteps were soft, muffled by the leather of his soles, but in the great stone silence of the dormitory, they were distinct. The shuffle of feet, the clearing of throats, the rustle of wool against wool. These were the sounds of vigils. The corridor outside the dormitory was a long, narrow passage of dressed stone. The stones had been cut and fitted by men who'd been dead for 300 years, and their work was smooth and precise. The floor was worn into a shallow depression down the center where countless sandals had passed over the centuries. Brother Aldous stepped into the corridor, and the air changed. It was colder here, a draught moving steadily from somewhere unseen, carrying with it the faint smell of damp limestone, and the more distant scent of the kitchen fires that would not be lit for hours yet. He joined the slow procession. There were no torches in the corridor. The monks moved by memory and touch, a hand placed lightly on the shoulder of the man in front, not for guidance, but for a sense of connection, a human chain winding through the dark belly of the sleeping abbey. Brother Aldous's hand rested on the wool-covered shoulder blade of Brother Paul the gardener, whose back was rounded from years of bending over cabbages. He felt the slight shift of muscle as Brother Paul took a step forward. They moved as one body. The cold was not a single sensation, but a layering of discomforts. It was the stone underfoot, so cold it seemed to pull the heat directly out through the leather of the sandals. It was the air against the cheeks and the tips of the ears, a sharp, biting presence. It was the way the wool of the habit, so heavy and smothering in the summer refectory, now felt thin and inadequate. And it was the knowledge that this cold would not lift for another 4 or 5 hours, that the sun was a distant promise on the other side of a vast frozen night. The line of monks descended a narrow, spiraling stone staircase. The steps were uneven, worn down in the center so that each footfall found a slightly different contour. The walls were close enough that the shoulders brushed against them, and the stone was slick with a faint, perpetual condensation. Brother Aldous could feel the texture of the chisel marks through the wool of his sleeve. The spiral was tight, the kind of staircase designed for defense or for a humility that forced the body to curve inward upon itself. Down and down they went, the sound of their breathing echoing strangely in the confined space until the quality of the air changed again. They emerged into the north transept of the abbey church. Here there was a little more light, though still not enough to see clearly. A pair of tallow candles burned on the iron stand near the entrance to the choir stalls, their flames long and steady in the absence of any wind. The church was vast, and the cold here was even greater than in the corridor. It was the cold of a space that was never truly warmed, a space built for stone and eternity, rather than for the fragile comfort of flesh. Brother Aldous could see his own breath plume out in front of him in a small white cloud that dissipated instantly. The vaulted ceiling high above was completely invisible, swallowed by a darkness so profound it seemed to be a solid thing pressing down. The monks filed into their assigned seats in the choir stalls. The wood of the stalls was dark and polished by centuries of use, and when Brother Aldous sat, the seat was hard and unyielding. He pulled his cowl up over his head, the rough wool falling across his brow and blocking the periphery of his vision. The world narrowed to the prayer book in front of him, the flickering candlelight on the lectern, and the sound of his own slow, steady heartbeat. The abbot entered, a tall figure whose face was mostly hidden by the shadow of his own cowl. He moved to his place and the office began. The chant was low, a murmur of voices that rose and fell in the ancient patterns of the Psalms. Brother Aldous did not sing loudly. His voice was a quiet, rough tenor that blended into the texture of the whole. The Latin words were so familiar they required no thought. They moved through his mind like water through a smooth channel, leaving no ripples. He stood, he sat, he knelt. The wood creaked. The candles guttered, the cold seep up from the flagstone then down from the anthem at the henth. This was the 8th hour of the night according to the old reckoning, the hour of watching and waiting for the dawn that was still an eternity away. The psalms were long. The prayers were longer. Time in the church at vigils did not pass. It accumulated layer upon layer of silence and soft sound, until the body lost track of its own boundaries and became just another part of the quiet architecture. After the final response, there was a pause. The abbot did not move toward the door. Instead, he turned his head slightly, and his gaze found Brother Aldous in the dim stalls. He made a small gesture with his hand, a simple raising of 2 fingers. It was a sign that required no interpretation. It was the sign of exemption. Brother Aldous had been given permission to leave the office before the final prayers of Lauds, which would follow vigils after only a short interval. His work was waiting. The other monks would remain in the church, watching and praying through the last dark hours until the first grey light of dawn crept through the high eastern windows. But Brother Aldous needed that light. He needed the specific, fragile, golden blow of a single candle flame applied to a sheet of uterine vellum. The work of copying Aulus Cornelius Celsus, the ancient Roman writer on medicine, would not progress in the dark. And the work, as the abbot often said with a quiet, patient weariness, was important, not urgent in the way of the world, but important in the way of preserving knowledge against the erosion of time. Brother Aldous rose slowly. His knees ached from the kneeling and the cold. He genuflected toward the altar, a movement made invisible by the dark and the folds of his habit, and then he stepped out of the choir stall. The sound of his leather sandals on the stone floor was the only sound besides the soft rustle of the other monks settling themselves for the next portion of the vigil. He walked back across the transept, his path a diagonal line across the vast, empty floor. The candle near the door was burning low now, the tallow pooling in a small, greasy lake around the wick. He passed through a low, arched doorway and into another corridor. This one was shorter and led not back to the dormitory, but toward the eastern range of the cloister. Here the air smelled faintly of old parchment, of dust, of the particular dry mustiness that was the signature of the scriptorium. The door to the scriptorium was heavy oak, bound with iron straps. He pushed it open and the hinges made no sound. They were kept well oiled with rendered fat, precisely for this reason, to preserve the silence of the house. The room inside was small by the standards of the church, but large for a workspace. It was long and narrow, with a row of high windows along one wall. At this hour those windows were just rectangles of a slightly less intense blackness, the stars invisible behind the low winter clouds. The room was dominated by a series of sloping wooden desks, each angled toward the window to catch the best of whatever light the day might offer. On one of these desks, the one closest to the small iron brazier that was never lit because of the danger to the manuscripts, lay the tools of Brother Aldous' labour. There was a wooden bookstand holding a heavy volume bound in oak boards. There was a neat row of quills, some cut fine and some cut broad. There was a small ceramic pot of ink, covered with a square of damp linen to keep it from drying out overnight. And there was a fresh sheet of vellum, held flat by two smooth stones from the river, its surface pale and slightly creamy in the faint light. Brother Aldous did not sit down immediately. First he crossed to the small alcove, where a single tallow candle sat in a heavy iron holder. He took a splinter of wood from a box on the shelf and held it to the wick of the guttering candle he had carried with him from the church. The flame caught, a small wavering tongue of yellow that seemed impossibly fragile. He touched it to the new wick and watched as the wax melted and the flame steadied and grew. The light pushed the shadows back a few feet, revealing the grain of the wooden desk, the pale surface of the vellum, the worn leather cover of the medical manuscript. Outside, the world was still and silent and frozen. Inside, the small circle of light was a tiny island of warmth and focus in a vast sea of darkness and cold. The bell had fallen silent now. The only sound was the soft, steady breathing of the scribe, and the occasional tiny hiss and pop of the tallow burning. The work of the night, the slow and careful work of preserving the words of the dead, was about to begin. Brother Aldous pulled his stool closer to the desk and sat down, his shadow falling huge and wavering against the lime-washed wall behind him. The first grey hint of dawn was more than 3 hours away, and there was much to do before the light returned to the world. The walk from the choir stalls to the buttery was short but cold. Brother Aldous kept his hands tucked into the wide opposing sleeves of his black wool habit. His fingertips were still stiff from the long stillness of vigils, and the stone floor of the scriptorium had not yet warmed his feet. The corridor smelled of old rushes and damp lime wash. There was no wind inside the cloister, but the air moved just enough to make the flame of his single tallow candle lean to one side. He shielded it with a cupped palm and watched the melted fat pool around the wick before the flame straightened again. At the end of the passage, a narrow arched doorway opened into the small room where the community kept its supplies for writing. The buttery was not a place for food. It was a low chamber cut into the thickness of the north wall, where the temperature stayed cool and even all year. Shelves of rough-hewn oak lined the walls from floor to chest height, and upon them sat a collection of lidded jars, clay pots, stoppered leather bottles, and small wooden boxes. There was no window. The only light came from the candle Brother Aldous carried, and it pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal the shapes of the vessels without showing their contents. He knew where everything was by habit and by the feel of the containers under his searching hand. He set the candle on a projecting stone ledge that had been worn smooth by generations of monks before him, and turned to face the shelf on the left. The oak galls were kept in a medium-sized earthenware crock with a heavy lid. The lid was unglazed on the underside, and it made a soft grinding sound when he lifted it away. Inside the crock, the galls lay heaped like a pile of small dark stones. They were roundish and knobbly, and some of them still showed the tiny exit hole where the gall wasp had chewed its way out the previous summer. Brother Aldous reached in and selected 6 of the largest specimens. He chose ones that felt dense and heavy in his palm because those held the richest concentration of tannin. He placed them in the hollow of a small stone mortar that sat permanently on the lower shelf and then replaced the lid of the crock with the same careful grinding sound. Next he needed gum arabic. It was stored in a small leather drawstring pouch that hung from a wooden peg driven into the mortar of the wall. The leather was old and dark with handling, and the string had been tied and untied so many times that it was soft as thread. He loosened the neck of the pouch and shook a few small crystalline lumps into his other hand. The gum arabic looked like pale amber fragments chipped from a larger mass, and they were slightly sticky to the touch from the moisture in the air. He returned all but 2 of the lumps to the pouch and placed the chosen pieces on the rim of the mortar next to the galls. The pouch went back onto its peg. The third component was the liquid. There was a lead cistern built into the corner of the buttery that collected rainwater from the roof of the cloister through a series of ceramic pipes. The water in the cistern was always cold, and it had a faint metallic sweetness from the lead. But the scribes had found that this particular water made the blackest ink. Brother Aldous lifted the wooden lid of the cistern. He could not see the water, but he could hear the small sound of a single drop falling from the pipe somewhere in the darkness. He lowered a small copper dipper that hung from a chain and brought it up full. The water was so cold that the metal of the dipper immediately grew a skin of condensation. He carried it carefully back to the shelf and poured the water into a small glazed beaker. The sound of the water hitting the bottom of the beaker was clear and high like a tiny bell. Now everything was assembled. Brother Aldous carried the stone mortar, the beaker, and the gum arabic out of the buttery and back into the corridor. The candle had burned down enough that the flame was now cupped in a small well of liquid tallow. He paused to tip the candle and let the excess fat run off onto the stone floor, where it would harden into a small white circle by morning. Then he continued along the passage and up a single wide step into the scriptorium. The scriptorium was a long, narrow room with a high vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. During the daylight hours, it would be filled with the grey light from a row of clear glazed windows set high in the eastern wall. But at this hour, long before dawn, the room was a cavern of darkness. The only illumination came from the candle Brother Aldous set on his own desk, and a second small lamp burning at the far end where Brother Paul the Armarius was already bent over a great antiphona with a fine brush. The 2 points of light did not meet. Between them lay a gulf of cold black air. Brother Aldous sat down on his wooden stool. The seat was polished to a high shine from years of use, and it was shaped now to the contours of his own body. He placed the mortar on the desk to the left of his writing slope. The beaker of rainwater went next to it. The lumps of gum arabic sat on a small square of scrap vellum. He adjusted the position of the candle so that its light fell directly on the mortar, and then he picked up the first oak gall. The gall was hard. He placed it in the mortar and pressed down with a small stone pestle. The first crack was loud in the quiet room. A sharp report that echoed for a fraction of a second against the vaulting and then died away. He stopped and looked toward the far end of the room. Brother Paul had not looked up. The sound of the antiphona brush continued in its soft, steady rhythm. Brother Aldous returned his attention to the mortar. He crushed the gall with a slow grinding motion. The outer shell of the gall was brittle, and it shattered into small jagged pieces under the weight of the pestle. The inside was a different material entirely. It was a dense, fibrous mass the color of old wood, and it resisted the pestle with a tough, springy texture. He had to press and rotate the pestle in a circle over and over. The motion was repetitive and soothing. His shoulder began to relax from the cold tension of the early hour, and his breathing slowed to match the rhythm of the grinding. The sound changed as the gall broke down from a high brittle crunch to a lower gritty scrape. He added the second gall, and the third and the fourth, and continued the same circular motion. Each gall required the same patient pressure and the same rotation of the wrist. The pile of dark powder at the bottom of the mortar grew slowly. When all 6 galls had been reduced to a coarse brown meal, he set the pestle aside and looked at his work. The powder was not fine enough yet. He could see small pale flecks of the fibrous interior still visible among the darker shell fragments. He picked up the pestle again and resumed the grinding with a lighter touch, working the powder against the stone sides of the mortar. The sound now was a soft, shushing like a hand brushing across dry sand. He did this for a long time. He did not count the minutes because the monastery measured time by the bells, and the bells would ring when they rang. There was only the motion of the pestle and the gradual darkening of the powder as the particles became smaller and more uniform. When the powder was fine enough to suit him, he stopped. His wrist ached slightly from the repeated motion, and he flexed his fingers open and closed a few times to ease the stiffness. The powder in the mortar was now a deep brownish grey, and it had no visible flecks. He could smell it now that it was broken open. The odour was earthy and bitter, and it reminded him of the forest floor in autumn after the leaves had fallen and begun to rot. It was not an unpleasant smell, but it was strong, and it cut through the cold air of the scriptorium. The next step was the addition of the rainwater. Brother Aldous picked up the beaker. The water was still cold, and the surface trembled slightly from the small movements of his hand. He poured it slowly into the mortar. The water was clear, and it pooled on top of the powder at first like a dark mirror. Then it began to seep down into the dry material. The colour changed immediately. Where the water touched the powder, it bloomed into a deep reddish black. He watched the water disappear into the mass, and then he began to stir with a small wooden spatula that he kept in a groove on the side of his desk. The spatula was made of boxwood, and it was stained dark from years of the same task. He stirred the mixture with a slow, patient motion. The powder did not want to mix at first. It clumped together in stubborn masses that resisted the spatula. He worked the lumps against the side of the mortar, pressing them flat and then folding the wet material back into the center. Gradually the mixture smoothed out. The color deepened further, becoming a rich dark brown that was almost, but not quite black. The consistency was like thin mud. He continued to stir. The spatula made a soft, wet sound as it moved through the liquid, and the mortar made a faint grinding noise each time the wood touched the stone bottom. These sounds were the only sounds in his corner of the room, aside from the occasional settling of the candle flame. After a time he judged that the mixture was smooth enough. He set the spatula aside on the square of scrap vellum and picked up the 2 small lumps of gum arabic. The gum was necessary to bind the pigment to the page and to give the ink a slight gloss when it dried. He dropped the lumps into the mortar. They vanished into the dark liquid without a sound. He stirred again. The gum arabic dissolved slowly. He could see small clear blobs of undissolved gum swirling in the dark mixture, and he chased them with the spatula, pressing them against the stone to speed their melting. The liquid grew slightly thicker and a little more viscous. A tiny bubble rose from the bottom of the mortar and popped silently on the surface. Now the ink needed to rest. Brother Aldous set the mortar to the side of his desk, where the candlelight would not heat it too much, and where it would not be disturbed by his writing arm. The surface of the ink was perfectly still, and it reflected the candle flame as a small wavering point of gold on a field of absolute black. He looked at it for a moment. The ink would be ready for the quill in perhaps an hour, and in the meantime it would continue to deepen in color as the tannins leached fully from the crushed gall powder into the water. He turned his attention to cleaning the tools. He wiped the wooden spatula on the scrap of vellum, and then on a corner of his habit where the black wool would hide the stain. The stone pestle he wiped clean with a dry rag that he kept in a niche under the desk. The rag was stiff with old dried ink, and it made a crackling sound when he unfolded it. He rubbed the pestle until no dark residue came off on the rag, and then he placed the pestle back in the groove next to the mortar. The rag went back into its niche. The beaker that had held the rainwater still had a few drops clinging to its inner surface. He carried it back through the cold corridor to the buttery. The candle flame streamed behind him as he walked, and the shadows of the arched doorways slid across the stone walls like slow black water. In the buttery, he replaced the beaker on its shelf, and then stood for a moment, looking at the crock of oak galls. He would need to gather more galls in the autumn when the wasps left their small round houses on the twigs of the oak trees in the forest beyond the monastery wall. But that was months away. There were enough galls in the crock for perhaps 2 more batches of ink, and then the community would have to make do with lampblack or purchase ink from the stationer in the town, which was a day's walk away and expensive. He returned to the scriptorium. The ink in the mortar had not changed visibly in his absence, but he knew that the slow chemistry of tannin and water and gum was working in the darkness of the liquid. He sat down on the polished stool and folded his hands on the desk. The candle was now half its original height. The flame was steady, and the small pool of melted tallow around the wick was clear and hot. He could feel the faint warmth of it on his face if he leaned slightly forward. At the far end of the room, Brother Paul turned a page of the antiphona. The sound of the great vellum leaf turning was a soft rustle like the wing of a large bird shifting in its sleep. Then the small brush resumed its quiet work. Brother Aldous closed his eyes for a moment. The smell of the crushed oak galls hung in the air round his desk, and the cold of the stone floor had finally begun to recede from his feet. Somewhere deep in the monastery, the kitchen fires were being stirred to life for the day's bread, and the faintest thread of wood smoke reached the scriptorium, a promise of warmth and food in the hours to come. But for now there was only the candle, and the ink, and the slow, patient waiting of the night. The ink in the stone mortar had been resting for the better part of an hour. During that time, Brother Aldous had not been idle, but he had also not been busy in any hurried sense of the word. He had simply moved through the small tasks that filled the space between preparation and execution. He had trimmed the wick of the candle with a small pair of iron snips, allowing the flame to burn more steadily and with less smoke. He had walked to the end of the scriptorium to borrow a pinch of fine sand from Brother Paul's supply for drying the ink later. He had arranged his quills in a neat row according to the width of their nibs, from the finest hairline point to the broader edge used for initial letters. And now he sat looking at the fresh sheet of vellum that waited for him under the two smooth river stones. The vellum was uterine vellum, which meant it came from the skin of a stillborn calf or a very young animal. It was the finest and most expensive writing surface available in the year 1378, and the monastery had obtained this particular sheet from a parchmenter in the town of Winchester 2 summers past. Brother Aldous knew its history because the armarius kept a careful ledger of all materials that entered the scriptorium. The sheet had travelled in a wooden chest packed with dried lavender to keep the moths away, and it had cost the community a sum equivalent to 3 months of tallow for the lamps. It was intended for a special purpose. The manuscript of Aulus Cornelius Celsus on medicine was a precious thing, a rare survival from the ancient Roman world, and it deserved a surface worthy of its words. Brother Aldous lifted the 2 river stones from the corners of the vellum. They were ordinary grey stones, smoothed by centuries of water flowing over them in the stream that ran along the eastern edge of the monastery lands. He set them aside on the desk, where they made a small dull sound against the wood. The vellum lay flat, now held down only by its own weight and the memory of being pressed. He leaned forward and brought the candle closer. The flame was at his left shoulder, positioned so that the light raked across the surface of the skin at a shallow angle. This was the way to see imperfections. Direct light from above would hide them, but a low slanting light would reveal every tiny rise and hollow. The surface of the vellum was pale and creamy, with a slight warmth in its tone. It was not white, like paper would be in some future century, but the colour of fresh cream, or the inner meat of an almond. The grain of the skin was visible as a fine network of tiny pores and faint lines. He looked at it for a long time. He let his eyes travel slowly across the entire rectangle, from the upper left corner near his left hand to the lower right corner farthest away. The motion of his gaze was unhurried. He was looking for the thing he knew would be there somewhere, because no sheet of vellum was ever perfect. The animal from which it came had lived, even if only briefly, and life left marks. He found it. There was a small patch near the center of the sheet, slightly to the right of where the spine of the manuscript would eventually fall. The patch was no larger than the nail of his smallest finger, but it was different from the skin around it. In the slanting candlelight, it showed a faint dullness where the surrounding area showed a soft, almost imperceptible sheen. He touched it with the tip of his index finger. The skin felt slightly cooler and smoother in that spot. It was a patch of grease, not grease from any human handling, but natural grease from the animal itself, a small concentration of oils that had not been fully removed during the long process of liming and scraping and stretching that transformed raw skin into writing surface. Grease on vellum was a problem. Ink made from oak galls was water-based, and it would not adhere properly to a greasy surface. The quill would slide and the line would bead up like rain on a waxed cloak. The letters would be thin and broken in that one spot, and over time they might flake away entirely. A manuscript was meant to last for centuries, and a single greasy patch could undo all the patient work of the scribe. The remedy was pumice. Brother Aldous opened the small wooden box that sat at the back of his desk. The box was made of beechwood and its lid was fitted with a simple leather hinge that had been replaced twice in his memory. Inside the box lay a collection of greyish-white stones of various sizes. They were pumice stones collected from the shores of a volcanic lake in a distant land and brought to England by merchants who traded in exotic goods. The stones were light and porous, so light that they seemed almost hollow in the hand. He selected one that was about the size of a walnut and slightly flattened on one side. It had been used many times before, and the flattened side was stained a soft grey from the vellum dust of previous corrections. He also removed a second object from the box. This was a small polished tooth from a wild boar set into a handle of turned boxwood. The tooth was curved and smooth, and it had been passed down through several generations of scribes in the monastery. Its purpose was to burnish the vellum after pouncing to close the grain of the skin and create a surface that would accept the ink cleanly without letting it spread into tiny feathery lines. Brother Aldous set the pumice stone on the desk to the left of the vellum and the boar's tooth burnisher on the right. He moved the candle an inch closer to the center of the workspace. Now he began to grind the pumice. He did not rub the stone directly on the greasy patch. That would create a visible depression, a thin spot in the skin that might tear under the pressure of the quill later. Instead, he rubbed the pumice stone against a small piece of waste vellum that he kept for this purpose. The motion was a slow circular grinding, and the sound was a soft rasping hiss. A fine greyish-white powder began to accumulate on the surface of the waste vellum. It was as fine as flour and lighter than dust. He continued the motion for perhaps 200 slow rotations of his wrist. The pile of powder grew. The sound filled the quiet corner of the scriptorium, a steady, repetitive noise that was neither loud nor soft, but simply present, like the sound of rain on a distant roof. When he had enough powder, he set the pumice stone aside and looked at the small grey pile. He dipped the pad of his middle finger into the powder, and then brought his finger to the greasy patch on the vellum. He began to rub the powder into the skin with a gentle circular pressure. The motion was small and precise. His fingertip moved in tiny circles never larger than the patch itself, and he watched as the fine grey powder slowly vanished into the surface of the vellum. The pumice was abrasive enough to remove the thin layer of grease, but fine enough not to cut the fibers of the skin. It worked by absorption and gentle friction. He continued this for a long time. The candle flame leaned slightly in a draught that he could not feel, and then straightened again. The patch began to change. In the slanting light, he could see the dullness fading and being replaced by the same soft, even sheen that characterized the rest of the sheet. The grease was lifting away, trapped in the microscopic pores of the pumice powder. He stopped and examined his work. He tilted his head to change the angle of the light. The patch was now almost indistinguishable from the surrounding vellum. There was still a faint residue of grey powder clinging to the surface, and he would need to remove it completely before he could write. He picked up a square of soft linen cloth that he kept in the niche under his desk. The cloth had been washed many times in the stream and beaten against the stones until it was as soft as a cloud. He folded it into a small pad and began to wipe the surface of the vellum with long, gentle strokes that moved from the center outward toward the edges. The grey powder lifted away, leaving the skin clean and slightly brighter where it had been. He wiped the entire sheet, even the areas that had not been treated, because the pumice powder was so fine that it drifted invisibly and could settle anywhere. The cloth picked up almost nothing by the end, just the faintest suggestion of grey against the white linen. Now the vellum was clean, but the surface had been disturbed by the pouncing. The fine top layer of the skin had been gently abraded, and the fibers were slightly raised. If he wrote on it now, the ink would bleed into these tiny raised fibers, and the letters would have a soft blurred edge like writing on a piece of felted wool. This was the reason for the boar's tooth burnisher. Brother Aldous picked up the burnisher. The handle was warm from resting on the desk near his hand, and it fit comfortably into his palm. The curved tooth projected from the end, and its surface was glossy from countless hours of use. He brought the tooth down onto the vellum at the upper left corner. He did not press hard. The weight of his hand was enough. He began to move the burnisher in long, smooth strokes that travelled from the top of the sheet to the bottom. Each stroke overlapped the previous one by half the width of the tooth. The motion was slow and rhythmic. The burnisher made a soft whispering sound as it moved across the skin, a sound like the wind moving through dry grass. The effect of the burnishing was subtle. He could see it in the slanting candlelight as he worked. The area behind the tooth grew slightly glossier and more compact. The raised fibers were being pressed down and aligned all in the same direction. The surface was becoming harder and smoother and more receptive to the sharp edge of a quill. He worked his way across the entire sheet from left to right. When he reached the far right edge, he lifted the burnisher and examined his work. The vellum now had a uniform low sheen, like the surface of a still pond, just before dawn. The greasy patch was gone, absorbed and removed, and the skin around it had been smoothed to the same texture as the rest of the sheet. He turned the vellum over and repeated the burnishing on the reverse side. The back of the sheet would not be written upon in this particular manuscript, but a smooth back surface prevented the vellum from curling and made the book lie flat when it was bound. The same slow rhythmic strokes, the same soft whispering sound, the same careful attention to the overlap. When he finished, he laid the sheet back onto the desk with the writing surface facing up, and placed the two smooth river stones back on the corners to hold it flat. The tools needed cleaning. The pumice stone went back into the beechwood box, along with the boar's tooth burnisher. The box was closed and returned to its place at the back of the desk. The linen cloth was shaken gently over the stone floor to release any remaining powder, and then folded and placed in the niche. The scrap of waste vellum with its small pile of unused pumice powder was folded carefully and tucked under the edge of the desk where it would be available for the next time. Brother Aldous sat back on his polished stool. His hands were dry and slightly dusty with the fine residue of the pumice, and he rubbed them together over the floor to let the particles fall. The candle had burned down another finger's width, and the pool of melted tallow was deep enough now that the wick was beginning to lean slightly. He straightened it with the tip of the iron snips and watched the flame recover its steady upright shape. The ink in the stone mortar had been resting all this time. He leaned over and looked at its surface. It was perfectly still and perfectly black. A faint skin had formed on the top where the liquid met the air, and when he breathed gently across it, the skin wrinkled and broke, revealing the glossy, wet darkness beneath. The vellum was ready. The surface was clean and smooth and uniformly receptive. The patch of grease was gone as if it had never existed. The sheet lay under the two river stones waiting for the first touch of the quill. Brother Aldous flexed his fingers. The cold had not entirely left his hands despite the warmth of the candle and the motion of the burnishing, but they were warm enough to hold a pen steady. He looked toward the high eastern windows of the scriptorium. There was no change in the blackness outside. The night was still deep, and the dawn was still hours away. At the far end of the long room, Brother Paul had set down his brush, and was now simply sitting with his hands folded in his lap, his head bowed either in prayer or in the light doze that came to old monks in the small hours. The second candle at his desk had burned low, and its light was a small orange star in the cavernous dark. Brother Aldous reached for the finest of the quills. It was a primary flight feather from a grey-lag goose cut to a hairline point. He held it up to the candlelight and sighted along the shaft to check that it was perfectly straight. It was. He dipped the nib into the ink and then touched it gently to the inner rim of the mortar to remove the excess. A single perfect drop fell back into the darkness and was gone. He brought the quill to the vellum and paused with the point hovering a hair's breadth above the surface. The time for preparation was over. The time for writing was about to begin. The quill hovered above the vellum for a long moment. Brother Aldous could feel the weight of the feather in his fingers, and the slight tremor of his pulse transmitted through the shaft. He did not lower the point. He raised it instead and set the quill back onto the desk beside the mortar of ink. The time for writing had not yet arrived. There was one more task that required his attention before the first letter could be formed, and it was a task that could not be rushed. The quill itself needed to be prepared. A feather plucked from the wing of a goose was not a pen until it had been cut and shaped by a human hand. The cutting of a quill was a small act of craft that determined everything that would follow. A poorly cut nib would snag the fibers of the vellum and spray fine droplets of ink across the page. A nib cut too broad would make letters that were fat and clumsy and consumed too much space. A nib cut too fine would scratch and skip and produce a line so faint that it could barely be read. The perfect nib was a balance between sharpness and smoothness, between flexibility and control. Brother Aldous had cut thousands of quills in his years in the scriptorium, and yet each one required the same patient attention as the first. He opened the shallow drawer built into the right side of his writing slope. Inside the drawer lay a collection of objects arranged in a specific order that never varied. There was a small iron penknife with a blade no longer than his thumb. The blade was curved slightly, and its edge was kept so sharp that it could split a hair. There was a scrap of hard leather for stropping the blade. There was a tiny earthenware dish containing a small amount of fine sand. There was a stiff brush made from the bristles of a wild boar, and there was a bundle of uncut quills tied together with a length of hemp twine. The quills were all primary flight feathers from the left wings of grey-lag geese. The left wing feathers were preferred because they curved away from the hand of a right-handed scribe and did not obscure the line of sight while writing. Brother Aldous untied the twine and selected a fresh quill from the bundle. He held it up to the candlelight. The feather was long and white, with a translucent quality near the base where the shaft emerged from the calamus. The barbs of the feather were clean and unbroken, and they lay flat against the central raches in a smooth, even line. He ran his thumb along the shaft from the tip down to the hollow base. The surface was smooth and slightly greasy from the natural oils of the bird. This oil would need to be removed before the quill could be cut, because it interfered with the curing process. He took the penknife from the drawer and held the blade at a shallow angle against the shaft near the base. With a single, slow, careful stroke, he scraped away the outer layer of the barrel. The sound was a soft shushing like the stroke of a whetstone against a scythe. A thin, translucent curl of keratin peeled away and fell onto the desk. He rotated the quill slightly and repeated the stroke. Then again and again, until the entire lower portion of the shaft had been scraped clean and the surface was uniformly matte. The scraped area was about the length of his middle finger. He set the knife down and brushed the fine white dust from the quill with the boar bristle brush. The dust drifted down onto the floor where it joined the grey powder of the pumice from the earlier work. The next step was to temper the quill. A fresh feather was too soft and flexible to hold a sharp point. It needed to be hardened by gentle heat. Brother Aldous reached into the drawer and removed a small iron rod that had been heating in the sand near the candle flame. The rod was not red hot, but it was warm enough to make the air shimmer slightly above its surface. He held the scraped portion of the quill above the rod and moved it slowly back and forth. He did not let the feather touch the metal. The heat radiated upward, and he watched as the translucent barrel began to change. It grew slightly more opaque and took on a faint golden tinge. The natural moisture inside the keratin was being driven out, and the structure of the material was tightening and hardening. He turned the quill over and over to ensure that the heat reached every side evenly. When the color had deepened to a uniform pale amber, he removed the quill from the heat and set it aside on the desk to cool. While the quill cooled, he tended to the penknife. The blade was sharp, but a few strokes on the leather strop would restore its keenest edge. He took the scrap of hard leather from the drawer and laid it flat on the desk. The leather was dark with age and impregnated with a fine abrasive powder that had been rubbed into it over many years. He drew the blade across the leather with a smooth pulling motion away from the cutting edge. The sound was a soft ringing hiss. He did this 6 times on one side of the blade and 6 times on the other. Then he tested the edge by holding it up to the candlelight and sighting along the bevel. The line of the edge was invisible, which meant it was sharp enough. The quill was cool now. He picked it up and turned it so that the curved underside of the shaft faced upward. This was the belly of the quill, and it was where the nib would be cut. He took the penknife and made the first cut. It was a single decisive stroke that removed the very tip of the barrel at a steep angle. The cut end was now an oval opening, exposing the hollow interior of the shaft. The pith inside was dry and white and slightly spongy. He scraped it out with the tip of the knife until the interior of the barrel was clean and smooth. The scraped pith fell onto the desk in small, dry crumbs. Now came the shaping of the nib. He made a second cut on the underside of the barrel, starting about half an inch from the tip and slicing upward to meet the first angled cut. This created a pointed shape like the prow of a small boat. The point was still blunt and unfinished, but the basic form was there. He held the quill up and sighted down the length of it. The cut was symmetrical and the point was centered, the muzzle slightly to himself, and returned the quill to the desk. The next cut was the most delicate. He used the tip of the knife to make a small slit in the very center of the nib point. The slit traveled upward from the tip for perhaps a quarter of an inch, following the natural curve of the barrel. This slit was the ink channel. It would draw the ink down from the reservoir of the hollow shaft to the very tip of the nib by capillary action. The slit had to be exactly centered and exactly straight. If it veered to one side, the ink would flow unevenly, and the line would be heavier on one edge than the other. Brother Aldous had cut so many quills that his hands knew the motion without his mind having to direct it. The knife point found the center and the slit opened with a tiny click that he felt more than heard. The final shaping was the scooping of the nib. He used the knife to carve away a small amount of material from each side of the point, creating a pair of shoulders that tapered down to the fine tip. The motion was a gentle paring stroke that removed a thin curl of translucent keratin. He did this on the left side, and then on the right. Then he held the quill up to the candlelight again. The nib was now a fine, pointed triangle with a central slit and two delicate shoulders. It was a perfect instrument. But the cutting of the quill was only half of the preparation. The nib needed to be tested before it could be trusted with the precious vellum and the careful words of Celsus. A test stroke on a piece of scrap would reveal any hidden flaw in the cut or in the tempering of the feather. Brother Aldous reached into the niche under his desk and removed a small folded piece of waste vellum. It was a scrap trimmed from the edge of a larger sheet that had been used for a different manuscript long ago. The scrap was thin and slightly yellowed, and it bore a few faint lines of old writing on one side. He turned it over so that the clean side faced up and placed it on the desk to the right of the fresh vellum sheet. He also needed lamp black. The ink in the stone mortar was pure oak gall ink made from the galls he had crushed earlier in the night. But lamp black was a different substance entirely. It was pure carbon collected from the smoke of a burning oil lamp, and it produced a dense matte black that was ideal for testing, because it dried almost instantly and showed every detail of the nib's performance. Brother Aldous kept a small supply of lamp black in a tiny lidded pot made of glazed earthenware. The pot sat in the drawer with his other tools. He removed it and lifted the lid. Inside was a fine black powder, as light as soot and as dark as the space between stars. He took a single drop of gum arabic solution from a small vial and placed it on the scrap of waste vellum. Then he touched the tip of a clean quill that he kept only for mixing to the lamp-black powder. The fine black particles clung to the quill tip. He transferred them to the drop of gum solution and stirred gently. The powder dissolved into the liquid, and the drop became a small pool of dense, opaque black. This was the test ink. It was not meant for permanence. It was meant only to show the quality of the nib. Brother Aldous picked up the newly cut quill and dipped the nib into the small pool of lamp-black ink. He touched the tip gently to the inner edge of the pool to remove any excess, and then brought the quill to the clean side of the scrap vellum. He paused. The first stroke was always a moment of truth. He lowered the nib until it just touched the surface of the vellum, and then he drew it downward in a slow, steady line. The line was perfect. It was a hair's breadth wide and uniformly black from top to bottom. The ink flowed smoothly from the slit and did not blob or skip. The edges of the line were crisp and clean with no feathering into the surrounding vellum. He made a second stroke parallel to the first. The same result. He made a curved stroke, a circle, and a series of small loops. The nib responded to every change of direction with perfect consistency. The tempering had been correct and the slit had been centered. The quill was ready, but he did not stop at the simple lines. A scribe's test stroke was also a moment of quiet practice, a way to settle the hand and the mind before the real work began. He drew a single letter on the scrap of vellum. It was the letter H, the first letter of the word hoc, which would begin the passage he intended to copy from Celsus. The letter was small and precise. The vertical strokes were straight and parallel. The crossbar was level and centered. The serifs at the top and bottom of the verticals were small, neat flourishes that he added without thinking. He looked at the letter. It was good, It was the letter of a scribe who had been doing this work for many years. He drew a few more letters, an A and an M and a small e. He watched how the ink dried on the scrap vellum. The lamp-black ink dried almost instantly, leaving a matte black surface that did not reflect the candlelight. The oak gall ink in the mortar would dry more slowly and with a slight gloss. He noted the difference and filed it away in his mind. The test had served its purpose. The quill was sharp and true. The hand was steady. The ink was ready. Brother Aldous set the test quill aside on a small rest made of folded linen. He took the scrap of waste vellum with its small black lines and letters and folded it carefully. He would keep it in the niche under the desk until it was full of test strokes, and then it would be given to the kitchen to be used for lighting the fires. Nothing was wasted in the monastery. Even the failed tests and the scraped pith and the shavings of keratin found their purpose eventually. The candle had burned down further. The pool of melted tallow was now deep, and the wick was beginning to bend under its own weight. Brother Aldous took the iron snips and trimmed the wick, carefully removing the charred portion and allowing the flame to spring back to a steady, upright shape. The light in the scriptorium brightened slightly. He could see the grain of the wood on his desk more clearly now, and the faint shadow of his own hand moving across the surface. At the far end of the long room, Brother Paul had roused from his doze and was once again bent over the antiphona. The small brush moved in its steady rhythm, and the sound was like the softest possible breath. The two scribes worked in their separate pools of light, separated by a gulf of cold, dark air. The scriptorium was silent except for these small sounds and the occasional distant settling of the stone building around them. Brother Aldous looked at the fresh sheet of vellum waiting under the two river stones. The surface was smooth and clean and faintly glossy from the burnishing. The greasy patch was gone. The quill was sharp. The ink in the stone mortar was dark and ready. The words of Aulus Cornelius Celsus lay open before him in the bound volume on the bookstand. He had copied this passage before in other manuscripts, but each copying was a new act of attention. The words were the same, but the light was different, and the cold was different, and the small variations of the quill and the ink in the vellum made each day's work unique. He dipped the quill into the oak gall ink. The nib disappeared into the black liquid, and when he withdrew it, a small bead of ink clung to the underside of the point. He touched the nib gently to the inner rim of the mortar, and the bead fell away. The point was now perfectly charged with just enough ink to form several letters before it would need to be dipped again. He brought the quill to the vellum. The first stroke of real ink on the fresh sheet was a small, deliberate movement. The nib touched the surface, and he felt the faint drag of the skin against the point. It was the right amount of resistance. Not so much that the quill caught and stuttered, and not so little that it slid without control. The ink flowed from the slit and pooled in the fine channel carved by the nib, and then it sank into the surface of the vellum and became part of it. He watched the line form behind the moving point. It was a good black with a slight warmth in its tone from the oak galls and the rainwater. The line was crisp and clean, and it would last for centuries. He wrote the first letter. It was an H. He wrote it slowly and carefully, forming the two vertical strokes, and then the crossbar. The letter was identical to the one he had drawn on the scrap of waste vellum, except that this one was permanent. This one would be read by eyes that had not yet been born. He paused and lifted the quill. The letter sat on the vellum in its small, perfect shape. The ink was still wet, and it gleamed softly in the candlelight. He waited for it to dry. The drying took perhaps 30 slow breaths. He watched the gleam fade as the water evaporated into the cold, dry air of the scriptorium, leaving behind only the dark stain of the tannins bound to the fibers of the skin by the gum arabic. When the H was dry to the touch, he dipped the quill again and wrote the next letter. It was an O, then a C. The word hoc took shape on the page. Hoc est. This is. The words of Celsus began to emerge from the darkness of the ink and the whiteness of the vellum. Brother Aldous worked slowly. Each letter was formed with the same patient attention. Each dip of the quill was followed by a pause to let the excess ink fall back into the mortar. Each line was laid down and then left to dry before the next line was begun. The rhythm of the work was slow and steady, like the turning of the great wheel in the kitchen or the movement of the stars across the winter sky. The night outside the high eastern windows remained absolute. The cold pressed against the stone walls and seeped through the leaded glass. But inside the small circle of candlelight, there was only the quill and the ink, and the vellum, and the slow, patient act of preservation. Brother Aldous wrote on. The words of a Roman physician dead for more than 1,000 years flowed through his hand and onto the page, and the silence of the scriptorium wrapped around him like a second woolen habit. The bell for Lords would ring eventually, and the community would gather again in the cold choir stalls. But that was still hours away, for now there was only the work. The words of Aulus Cornelius Celsus moved across the page in a slow procession of small dark letters. Brother Aldous worked with a rhythm that had become as natural to him as breathing. Dip the quill, touch the inner rim, form the letter, watch the ink dry, dip again. The candle flame stood steady at his left shoulder, and the only sound in his corner of the scriptorium was the faint scratching of the nib against the burnished vellum and the occasional soft click of the quill being set down on the linen rest. The night outside the high windows remained absolute and unchanging. The cold seeped through the stone walls in a slow, persistent wave, but he had long since stopped noticing it. His attention was entirely on the page. The manuscript from which he copied lay open on the wooden bookstand to his left. It was an old copy of the Benedictine, perhaps 100 years old, written in a neat but somewhat cramped Carolingian minuscule that had been the standard hand of an earlier generation of scribes. The vellum of the exemplar was darkened with age and handling, and the margins were filled with small annotations in various later hands. Some of the annotations were corrections of obvious scribal errors. Others were comments on the medical content added by readers who had been physicians, or barber surgeons, or simply curious monks with an interest in the workings of the human body. Brother Aldous did not read these annotations as he copied. His task was to reproduce the main text faithfully, without adding or subtracting anything. The commentary of later readers belonged to later readers. The passage he was copying concerned the treatment of a simple fracture of the forearm. Celsus described the condition with the precise economical language of a Roman writer who assumed intelligence in his audience. The bones of the forearm, he wrote, were 2 in number, the radius and the ulna, and they ran parallel from the elbow to the wrist. When one of these bones was broken by a fall or a blow, the arm would swell and become painful, and the broken ends of the bone could sometimes be felt beneath the skin as a slight irregularity. The treatment was to pull the arm straight with a steady, gentle traction until the broken ends aligned, and then to bind it firmly with bandages so that the bone could heal in its proper position. Brother Aldous had copied this passage before. He had copied it into a small medical compendium for the infirmarian 3 winters ago, and he had copied it again for a manuscript that was sent to the daughter house in Normandy. The words were familiar to him now. He knew that after the description of the traction cells would describe the application of the bandages in careful detail, and that the bandages would need to be changed every few days, and that the arm should be kept immobile for several weeks. He knew these things not because he was a physician, but because he had written them down so many times that they had become part of his mental furniture. He did not think about the meaning of the words as he wrote them. He thought about the shape of the letters and the spacing between them and the way the ink flowed from the nib. The word he was writing now was brachium. It was a simple word meaning the arm from the elbow to the wrist. He formed the B with a single smooth stroke starting at the top and curving down and around to the right, before closing the loop and adding the vertical stem. The R was a quick downstroke with a small hook at the top. The A was an uncial form made with 2 strokes, a curved bowl and a straight back. The C was a simple curve. The H was a downstroke with a curved shoulder. The I was a single short stroke with a fine dot above it. The I was 2 downstrokes connected by a curve at the bottom. The was 3 downstrokes with connecting arches. He wrote the word without pausing, and then he stopped to let the ink dry. While the ink dried, he looked ahead in the exemplar. The next few lines describes the specific method of bandaging that Celsus recommended for a fracture of the forearm. The bandage should be applied first to the hand and wrist, then carried up the arm in a spiral, then reversed and brought back down, then secured with a few turns around the elbow. The description was clear and methodical. Brother Aldous read it twice to be certain of the sequence, and then he returned his gaze to the fresh vellum. The ink on the last word was dry. He dipped the quill and continued. He wrote the phrase, fascia adibenda est. The bandage is to be applied. The letters formed themselves under his hand with the same careful precision. Fascia was a word he knew well. It appeared many times in the surgical sections of Celsus. It meant a strip of cloth used for binding wounds or supporting injured limbs. The F was a tall letter with a crossbar and a descender that dropped below the line. The A was the same uncial form. The S was a longs that looked almost like an F without the crossbar, and it required a particular care to distinguish it. The C was a simple curve. The I was a short stroke with a dot. The final A was another uncial. He wrote the word and then paused again. The next word in the exemplar stopped him. He had been moving through the text with the smooth, unconscious fluency of long familiarity, but this word brought his hand to a halt. It was a word he did not recognize. It was written in the exemplar in Greek letters rather than Latin, and the scribe of the old manuscript had formed the characters with a slight hesitancy that suggested he had not been entirely comfortable with the Greek alphabet. Brother Aldous leaned closer to the candle and studied the word. It appeared to be ensnash unsmime asai, or something very like it. The letters were small and cramped, and the ink had faded slightly over the centuries since they were written. He knew a little Greek. All the scribes in the monastery knew a little Greek because the Gospels contained Greek words and the Church Fathers occasionally quoted Greek authors. But his knowledge was limited to the common words that appeared in the liturgy and the scriptural commentaries. This word was not one of those. It was a medical term of some kind, and its meaning was not obvious from the context. Celsus was describing a particular method of bandaging, and this Greek word appeared to be the name of the bandage itself. Brother Aldous set down the quill on the linen rest. He could not simply guess at the spelling and write the word as best he could. A scribe's duty was to reproduce the text exactly as it appeared in the exemplar without alteration or omission. If he did not understand a word, he was required to find out what it meant and how it should be written. The monastery possessed a small collection of reference works for precisely this purpose. They were kept on a shelf in the armarius's corner of the scriptorium, where the light from the high windows was strongest during the day. At this hour of the night, the shelf was in deep shadow, but he knew where everything was. He rose from his stool. The movement was slow and careful because his legs had grown stiff from the long sitting. The cold air of the scriptorium closed around him as he stepped away from the small warmth of the candle. He walked the length of the room toward the far end where Brother Paul was still bent over the antiphona. The armarius looked up as Brother Aldous approached. His face was deeply lined, and his eyes were red-rimmed from the strain of working by candlelight, but his expression was calm and unsurprised. Visitors to his corner of the scriptorium were a regular occurrence. Brother Aldous inclined his head slightly. "The Greek glossary," he said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. The rule of silence was relaxed in the scriptorium for necessary communication, but the habit of quiet speech was deeply ingrained. Brother Paul nodded and gestured with his chin toward a shelf on the north wall. The shelf was a long oak board supported by iron brackets driven into the stone. Upon it rested perhaps a dozen books of varying sizes. Some were bound in plain oak boards like the De Medicina. Others were smaller pamphlets sewn into limp vellum covers. A few were simply gatherings of leaves held together with leather thongs. Brother Aldous knew the shelf well. He had consulted it many times over the years for difficult words and unclear passages. He reached up and removed a small volume from the middle of the shelf. It was a glossary of Greek medical terms compiled perhaps 200 years earlier by a physician in Salerno who had studied the ancient texts and recorded the meanings of the unfamiliar words. The volume was thin, and its vellum cover was soft and worn. He carried it back to his desk, walking slowly so as not to disturb the dust motes that hung suspended in the still air of the scriptorium. The candle flame leaned slightly as he passed, and then straightened again. He sat down and opened the glossary. The pages were made of a cheaper grade of vellum than the De Medicina manuscript. They were thicker and yellower, and some of them showed the hair follicles of the animal from which they had been made. The writing was small and dense, arranged in 2 columns on each page. The Greek words were written first in a careful minuscule hand, and then followed by a Latin translation or explanation. Brother Aldous turned the pages slowly. The vellum made a soft crackling sound as it moved, and the faint smell of old parchment rose from the book. He found the section of words beginning with sigma. His finger traced down the column of Greek terms. Slash, idlik, skeleton, skeleton, dlik, rik, and found it kids, and tyke, lick, the kmatakaid. A wrapping. He read the entry twice to be certain. The word meant a bandage that was wrapped around a limb in a particular way designed to cover and protect the injured area while providing gentle compression. It was not a common term even in medical Latin, but its meaning was clear enough. He closed the glossary and sat for a moment looking at the entry in his mind. The word would need to be written in Greek letters in his copy, just as it appeared in the exemplar. He would not transliterate it into Latin characters. The purpose of the manuscript was to preserve the text exactly as Celsus had written it, or as close to that original as the chain of copies allowed. If Celsus had used a Greek word, then the Greek word must remain. But writing Greek letters required a different movement of the hand than writing Latin. The shapes were different. Some of them had no equivalent in the Latin alphabet. Brother Aldous had learned to form the Greek letters years ago when he was first apprenticed to the scriptorium, but he did not use them often. He would need to practice the word on a scrap before committing it to the precious vellum. He took the folded piece of waste vellum from the niche under his desk and smoothed it flat. The lamp-black test strokes from earlier in the night were still visible on one side. He turned it over to a clean area. Then he dipped a fresh quill into the oak gall ink. This quill was slightly broader than the one he used for the Latin text. A broader nib was better for Greek letters, which tended to have more horizontal strokes and required a more generous flow of ink. He wrote the word slowly. Sigma was a curved stroke that looked like a small crescent moon lying on its back. Kappa was a vertical stroke with 2 short diagonals branching off to the right. Epsilon was a vertical stroke with 3 short horizontals. Pi was a horizontal top bar with 2 vertical legs. Alpha was a loop with a tail. Sigma appeared again. Mu was a series of connected vertical strokes with a tail at the end. Alpha appeared again. He finished the word and looked at it. The letters were a little stiff and uncertain. The sigma at the beginning was too large in proportion to the other letters. The mu at the end was cramped. He had not written Greek in many months, and his hand had lost the ease of the forms. He wrote the word again below the first attempt. This time, the sigma was smaller and better proportioned. The kappa was more confident. The epsilon was crisp. The pi was level. The alpha was smooth. The final sigma and mu were still slightly awkward, but improved. He wrote the word a third time. The letters now flowed with something like the ease of his Latin hand. The sigma was quadrate. The mu was balanced and even. The whole word looked as though it belonged on the page. He set the practice scrap aside and picked up the fine quill he used for the main text. He dipped it into the ink and touched the rim of the mortar. Then he brought the nib to the fresh vellum at the place where he had stopped. He wrote the Greek word sex hinmaaz and sit manamil with slow, deliberate strokes. The letters were small and precise, formed with the same care he gave to the Latin text. When he finished, he lifted the quill and examined the word. It was good. It matched the exemplar in size and spacing, and it would not look out of place among the Latin words that surrounded it. He waited for the ink to dry. The Greek letters had required a little more ink than the Latin ones, and the drying took a few extra breaths. He watched the wet gleam fade from the surface of the vellum until the word was a matte black against the cream of the skin. Then he continued with the Latin text. The passage went on to describe the application of the sax nich, muckle and et sax nets and decrobe detail. The bandage was to be made of soft linen cloth torn into strips about 3 fingers wide. The first strip was wound around the hand and wrist. The second strip was carried up the arm in a spiral overlapping the previous turn by half its width. The third strip was reversed at the elbow and brought back down. The whole was then secured with a few final turns and tied off with a simple knot. The compression should be firm but not tight enough to cause pain or numbness in the fingers. Celsus was precise about this point. A bandage that was too tight would do more harm than the fracture itself. Brother Aldous copied these instructions with the same patient attention he had given to the earlier parts of the passage. The words formed themselves under his hand in a steady, unhurried stream. He wrote about the width of the linen strips, and the direction of the spiral, and the number of turns around the elbow. He wrote about the signs that the bandage was too tight, including a change in the color of the fingernails and a sensation of cold in the hand. He wrote about the need to check the bandage every day and to loosen it slightly as the swelling of the arm subsided. The work was methodical and repetitive and deeply calming. The candle burned down further. The pool of melted tallow was now so deep that the wick was floating in a small lake of liquid fat. Brother Aldous paused in his writing to tend to it. He took a scrap of waste vellum and used it to soak up some of the excess tallow, blotting it carefully, and setting the soaked scrap aside to be used as a fire starter later. Then he pushed the wick a little higher with the tip of the iron snips so that it stood clear of the liquid. The flame brightened and steadied. The light on the page became clearer, and the shadows at the edges of the desk retreated slightly. He returned to the text. The passage on the fracture of the forearm was nearly complete. Celsus ended the section with a brief note on the expected duration of healing. A simple fracture in a healthy adult would take about 30 days to knit firmly enough that the bandages could be removed. During that time, the patient should keep the arm still and avoid any heavy lifting or sudden movements. After the bandages were removed, the arm would be stiff and weak and would require gentle exercise to restore its full function. Celsus recommended squeezing a ball of soft wax or kneading a lump of bread dough as useful exercises for restoring strength to the hand and wrist. Brother Aldous wrote these final words and then sat back on his stool. The section was complete. The page of fresh vellum now held perhaps 200 words of Latin text, and one small Greek word inserted carefully among them. The letters were even and well spaced. The lines were straight. The margins were generous on all sides, leaving room for the illuminator who would eventually add the decorated initials and the marginal flourishes that would make the manuscript beautiful as well as useful. He looked at his work for a long moment. It was good work. It was not exciting work, and it was not work that would ever be celebrated or even noticed by anyone beyond the walls of the scriptorium, but it was good work. The words of Celsus had been preserved for another generation. He set down the quill and flexed his fingers. The joints of his hand ached slightly from the prolonged gripping of the shaft. He opened and closed his fist several times, feeling the blood return to the fingertips. The cold had crept back into his hands while he was writing, and he cupped them briefly around the candle flame, absorbing what little warmth it offered. The flame flickered and danced in response to his breath. At the far end of the scriptorium, Brother Paul had set aside his brush and was now cleaning his tools. The antiphona lay closed on his desk, its great wooden boards protecting the pages within. The armarius wiped his brush on a scrap of linen and placed it in a pottery jar with the other brushes. Then he rose slowly and stretched his back with a soft grunt. He looked across the long dark room toward Brother Aldous and raised a hand in a small gesture of farewell. It was time for him to return to the dormitory for a few hours of rest before prime. Brother Aldous raised his own hand in response. The armarius picked up his candle and walked to the door. The small point of light moved across the darkness and then vanished through the archway, leaving Brother Aldous alone in the scriptorium. The silence deepened. Without the small sounds of Brother Paul's brush and the occasional rustle of his movements, the room seemed larger and colder. Brother Aldous sat for a while without moving. His candle was now the only light in the entire eastern range of the monastery. The flame was a small golden star in a vast sea of darkness. He listened to the silence. It was not a complete silence. There was the faint tick of the cooling stone in the walls. There was the soft hiss of the candle flame. There was the sound of his own breathing, slow and even, and somewhere far away beyond the cloister and the church and the outer wall, there was the sound of the wind moving across the frozen fields. It was a low sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. It had been there all night, he realized, but he had not noticed it until now. He looked at the page of vellum on his desk. The ink was dry and the words were fixed. He placed a small square of clean linen over the written area to protect it from dust, and then he closed the wooden boards of the De Medicina exemplar. The book made a soft, solid sound as the boards came together. He lifted it from the stand and carried it to the shelf where it belonged. The shelf was in deep shadow, and he had to find the place by touch, running his fingers along the spines of the other books, until he felt the familiar shape of the iron clasp. He slid the volume into its place. He returned to his desk and looked at the remaining hours of the night. The bell for Lord's would ring soon. He could hear it in his mind even before it sounded, the low vibration that would travel down through the stone and call the community back to the choir. There was time for perhaps a little more work before then. He picked up the quill and dipped it into the ink. The next passage in Celsus concerned the treatment of a dislocated shoulder. He began to read the first few lines, forming the letters in his mind before he committed them to the page. The night was still deep and the work was still waiting. The sound of the door opening was so soft that Brother Aldous did not hear it at first. He was bent over the fresh page of vellum with his quill moving in its slow, steady rhythm, and his attention was entirely absorbed by the formation of a particularly difficult ligature between a longs and a T in the word est. The door was heavy oak, bound with iron straps, and its hinges were kept well oiled with rendered fat, precisely so that it would not disturb the scribes at their work. It swung inward without a creak, and a figure entered the scriptorium on feet that made no sound on the stone floor. The first indication Brother Aldous had that he was no longer alone was a subtle change in the quality of the candlelight. A second shadow fell across the page. He looked up. The abbot was standing 3 paces from his desk. The abbot was a tall man whose face was mostly hidden by the deep cowl of his black wool habit. In the dim light of the single candle, his features were a landscape of shadows and faint highlights. The bridge of his nose caught the light. His eyes were deep-set and invisible. His beard was grey and closely trimmed. He stood with his hands tucked into his sleeves, and his posture was relaxed and patient, as if he had been standing there for some time waiting to be noticed. Brother Aldous set down his quill on the linen rest and began to rise from his stool, but the abbot raised one hand in a small gesture that meant remain seated. The abbot did not speak immediately. He took a step closer to the desk and looked down at the open page. His gaze travelled across the lines of fresh writing, the small dark letters marching in their even rows. He studied the Greek word skak, thintinfits, and mests maiar for a moment, and then moved on. His expression did not change. He was not reading the text for its medical content. He was looking at the quality of the work, the consistency of the hand, the evenness of the spacing. After a long pause, he nodded, once a small, slow movement of the head that was barely visible under the shadow of the cowl. "The hand is steady tonight," the abbot said. His voice was low and rough, from the cold and from the long silence of the night office. It was a voice that did not carry far. It seemed to fall into the air and disappear after travelling only a few feet. Brother Aldous inclined his head in acknowledgment. He did not speak. There was no need to fill the silence with words. The abbot had not come to the scriptorium to discuss the quality of the copying. He had come for another purpose, and he would state it in his own time. The abbot was a man who measured his words carefully and did not waste them on pleasantries. The abbot reached into the folds of his habit and withdrew a small piece of vellum. It was a scrap trimmed from the edge of a larger sheet, much like the ones Brother Aldous kept in the niche under his desk for test strokes. The scrap was perhaps the size of the man's palm, and it bore a few lines of writing in a hand that Brother Aldous recognized as that of the prior. The ink was dark and fresh, and the letters were small and cramped. The abbot held the scrap out, and Brother Aldous took it. He angled the scrap toward the candlelight. The prior's handwriting was not elegant. It was a utilitarian hand, developed for keeping accounts and recording the daily business of the monastery, rather than for preserving ancient texts. The letters were formed quickly and without flourish, and some of them ran together in ways that made the words difficult to pass. Brother Aldous read the lines slowly. The message was a draft of a letter to be sent to the Archbishop's secretary in Canterbury. It concerned a matter of ecclesiastical administration that had arisen from the current situation in the Church. The situation in the Church was this. In the spring of that same year, 1378, the cardinals in Rome had elected a new pope, an Italian named Bartolomeo Prignano, who took the name Urban VI. Then a few months later, a group of the same cardinals, claiming that the election had been made under duress from the Roman mob, had met in Fondi and elected a second pope, a Frenchman named Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. Now there were two men each claiming to be the rightful successor to St. Peter. One sat in Rome, the other sat in Avignon. The nations of Christendom were choosing sides. France and Scotland and Savoy and Castile had declared for Clement. England and the Holy Roman Empire and Hungary and Poland had declared for Urban. The Great Schism had begun, but none of this turmoil reached the scriptorium of the Benedictine monastery in any direct way. The monks knew of the schism because travellers brought news, and because letters arrived from the mother house, and because the abbot received instructions from the bishop. But the knowledge was abstract. It was a matter of names and seals and administrative formalities. The daily rhythm of the divine office continued unchanged. The copying of manuscripts continued unchanged. The copying of manuscripts continued. The only practical consequence for the community was that certain documents now required a specific formulation of loyalty. The letter the prior had drafted was one such document. Brother Aldous read the draft. It was a short letter acknowledging the receipt of a communication from the Archbishop's court and affirming the monastery's obedience to the lawful authority of the Church. The prior had written the name of the Pope as Urbanus. The spelling was correct. Urbanus with a U and an A and an A and the rest. Brother Aldous looked up from the scrap. The abbot was watching him with those deep-set, invisible eyes. "The spelling," the abbot said. "You are certain?" It was not a question. It was a statement that invited confirmation. The abbot could read Latin as well as any educated man of his station, but he was not a scribe. The fine distinctions of orthography were not his domain. He had come to the scriptorium because Brother Aldous was the authority on such matters within the walls of the monastery. If the letter was to be copied out in a fair hand and sealed with the community seal and sent to Canterbury, it must contain no errors. A misspelled name and a letter of compliance could be interpreted as carelessness or worse, as a subtle insult. In a time when the Church was divided and allegiances were being scrutinized, even the shape of a letter could carry weight. Brother Aldous looked at the name again. Urbanus. The U was the first letter. It was a simple letter, formed with two downstrokes connected by a curve at the bottom. The R was a downstroke with a small hook. The B was a loop and a stem. The A was an uncial form. The N was two downstrokes with a connecting arch. The R was another pair of downstrokes. The S was a long S that curved down below the line. He traced the letters in his mind and found no fault. "It is correct," he said. His voice was quiet, matching the abbot's tone. The abbot nodded again. The movement was slow and deliberate. He reached out and took the scrap of vellum back from Brother Aldous's hand. He folded it once and then again and tucked it back into the folds of his habit. The matter was settled. The spelling was correct. The letter would be written out in the morning by the prior's secretary and sent on its way to Canterbury, with the next traveller passing through the monastery gates. The great division in the Church had been reduced to a question of orthography, and that question had been resolved in less than a minute. The abbot did not leave immediately. He stood beside the desk for a while longer, looking at the open page of the De Medicina manuscript. The candlelight flickered, and the shadows moved across his face. He seemed to be thinking about something, but whatever it was, he did not speak of it. Brother Aldous sat with his hands folded on the desk, waiting. The silence between them was comfortable and unforced. It was the silence of two men who had spent decades in a community where speech was rationed, and silence was the default state of human interaction. After a time, the abbot reached out and touched the edge of the vellum page with one finger. The touch was light, almost reverent. He traced the margin where the illuminator would later add the decorated border. Then he withdrew his hand and tucked it back into his sleeve. "The work continues," he said. Brother Aldous nodded. The work continued. It all we could cook was quilted. The copying of Celsus would take many more weeks, and after Celsus there was a treatise on the properties of herbs that the infirmarian had requested, and after that there was a volume of sermons by St. Augustine that needed to be replaced because the old copy was falling apart from use. The work of the scriptorium was never finished. It was a river that flowed from the past into the future, and the scribe was only a vessel through which it passed. The abbot turned away from the desk. He walked to the door with the same soundless steps with which he had entered. His tall figure moved through the candlelight and then into the deeper shadow near the archway. He paused at the threshold and looked back. His face was a pale oval in the darkness. "The bell for Lords will ring soon," he said. "You will join the community." It was not a command. It was a reminder of the rhythm that governed their lives. Brother Aldous had been excused from the later part of vigils to begin his work, but Lord's was the morning prayer, the office that greeted the dawn. All members of the community were expected to be present, unless illness or urgent necessity prevented it. The copying of Celsus was important, but it was not more important than the common prayer. Brother Aldous inclined his head. He would come. The abbot nodded once more and then stepped through the archway and was gone. The door closed behind him with the same silent softness. The scriptorium was once again empty except for the scribe and the candle and the waiting page. Brother Aldous sat for a moment without moving. The abbot's visit had been brief and undramatic. It had interrupted the flow of the work for only a few minutes. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. The outside world had entered the scriptorium in the form of a scrap of vellum and a question about the spelling of a name. The schism was not just a distant rumor anymore. It was a name that had to be written correctly on a letter of compliance. It was a choice of ink and vellum and orthography. It was an administrative fact as mundane as the ordering of supplies or the repair of a leaking roof. He thought about the name Urbanus. He had written it many times over the years in various documents, long before it had become the name of a disputed pope. It was a common enough name in the Latin world. There had been saints named Urban and bishops and ordinary men. Now it was the name around which the unity of the church had fractured. Brother Aldous did not have an opinion about the schism. He was a scribe, not a theologian or a canon lawyer. His task was to copy texts accurately and to preserve the words of the ancients for the benefit of those who would come after. The question of which man in which city was the true pope was a matter for the abbot and the bishop and the princes of the world. It did not touch the work on his desk. He picked up the quill. The nib was still charged with ink from before the abbot's arrival. He touched it gently to the rim of the mortar to remove any excess that might have dried on the point, and then he brought it back to the page. He found his place in the text. The next word was luxationium, dislocation. He formed the law with a tall downstroke and a small foot at the base line. The U was 2 strokes. The X was a crossed pair of diagonals. He wrote the word slowly re-establishing the rhythm that had been interrupted. The passage on the dislocated shoulder was similar in structure to the one on the fractured forearm. Celsus described the anatomy of the joint in clear, precise language. The head of the humerus was a smooth, rounded knob that fit into a shallow socket in the shoulder blade. When the arm was pulled or twisted with sufficient force, the head could slip out of the socket and become lodged in the soft tissues of the armpit. The patient would be unable to move the arm, and the shape of the shoulder would appear flattened and deformed. The treatment was to restore the head of the bone to its proper place by a maneuver that involved traction and counter-traction and a specific rotation of the arm. Brother Aldous copied these words with the same patient attention he had given to the earlier passages. The quill moved across the vellum in its slow, deliberate path. The ink flowed from the slit and sank into the burnished surface. The letters formed themselves one by one: luxatio, humerus, scapula, axilla. The Latin words were familiar and comforting. They described a world that was orderly and knowable, a world in which bones fit into sockets and could be put back when they slipped out. It was a different world from the one in which popes were elected and then rejected and then replaced by other popes. In the world of Celsus, things were what they appeared to be and could be fixed by the application of knowledge and skill. The candle burned on. The flame was steady. Now the wick trimmed and the pool of tallow at a manageable depth. The light fell on the page in a warm golden circle. Beyond the circle, the scriptorium was a cavern of darkness and cold. Brother Aldous was aware of the vast empty space around him, but he did not feel alone. The presence of the words on the page and the rhythm of the copying filled the silence in a way that was almost companionable. The work was its own kind of company. He wrote about the method of reducing the dislocation. The patient was to be seated on a low stool. An assistant was to stand behind the patient and place a folded cloth in the armpit. The physician was to take hold of the patient's wrist and pull the arm downward and slightly outward while the assistant pulled upward on the cloth. When the head of the bone was felt to slip back into the socket, there would be a palpable clunk, and the patient would experience immediate relief. Celsus described the maneuver with the precision of a man who had performed it many times. Brother Aldis could almost see the scene in his mind. The physician's hands on the patient's wrist, the assistant's steady pull on the cloth, the moment of release when the bone found its home. He paused in his writing and flexed his hand. The joints of his fingers were stiff from the cold and from the prolonged gripping of the quill. He set the pen down and rubbed his hands together, slowly feeling the friction generate a small warmth. The skin of his palms was rough and calloused from years of work. The fingertips were permanently stained with a faint darkness that no amount of washing could remove. They were the hands of a scribe, and they bore the marks of their trade as clearly as a mason's hands bore the dust of stone. He looked toward the high eastern windows. There was still no light. The winter night was long, and the dawn was slow in coming. But he knew that the darkness outside was not as absolute as it had been when he first sat down at his desk. There was a subtle change in the quality of the blackness beyond the glass. It was not yet grey, but it was no longer the deep, impenetrable black of midnight. The world was beginning to turn toward the sun, even if the sun was still far below the horizon. The bell for Lords would ring soon, as the abbot had said. He returned to the page. He had reached the end of the section on the dislocated shoulder. Celsus concluded with a brief note on the aftercare. The arm should be bound to the chest with a soft bandage for a few days to allow the stretched tissues to recover. After that, the patient could begin to use the arm gently, but should avoid heavy lifting or throwing for several weeks. The shoulder joint, once dislocated, was more prone to dislocate again, and the patient should be cautioned about activities that might put it at risk. Brother Aldis wrote these final words and then set down the quill. The page was now more than half full. The lines of text marched down the vellum in their orderly rows. The letters were even and well formed. The margins were straight. The Greek word nat sat among the Latin words like a small dark jewel. It was good work. It was not finished work, but it was good work for one night. He placed the square of clean linen over the written area and set the 2 river stones on the corners to hold the vellum flat. Then he closed the De Medicina exemplar and carried it back to its shelf. He stood for a moment in the center of the scriptorium. The candle on his desk was the only light. Its flame was a small, steady point of gold in the vast darkness. He could hear the sound of his own breathing and the faint tick of the cooling stone and the distant murmur of the wind outside the walls. The scriptorium was cold and silent and empty, but it was not a lonely place. It was a place of work and patience and the slow preservation of words that had travelled across 1,000 years to reach this moment. He picked up the candle. The holder was warm in his hand, and the flame leaned slightly as he moved. He walked to the door and paused to look back at his desk. The vellum lay under its linen cover, waiting for his return. The ink in the mortar was still dark and usable. The quills were arranged in their neat row. Everything was in order. He would return after Lords and after the morning meal, and the work would continue. He stepped through the archway and into the cold corridor. The candle pushed a small circle of light ahead of him, revealing the worn stones of the floor and the rough plaster of the walls. He walked slowly toward the church. Somewhere ahead of him in the darkness, he could hear the soft shuffle of other feet as the community gathered for the morning prayer. The bell had not yet rung, but it would ring soon. The rhythm of the day was about to resume. The schism and the letter of compliance and the name Abanus were already fading into the background of his mind, replaced by the familiar words of the psalms that he would soon be singing. The work of the night was done. The work of the day was about to begin. The bell for sext had rung and fallen silent. The sound of it still seemed to hang in the cold air of the cloister walk as Brother Aldis made his way from the scriptorium toward the refectory. The morning had passed in the slow accumulation of small tasks. After Lords, he had returned to his desk and copied another page of Celsus concerning the reduction of a dislocated jaw. Then there had been terce, and the chapter meeting where the abbot had read aloud a list of minor duties for the week. Brother Aldis had been assigned to help turn the hay in the loft above the stables, but that task was for the afternoon when the light was better. Now was the hour of the midday meal, and his stomach was a hollow space that made itself known with a faint, dull ache. The refectory was a long high hall built against the south wall of the cloister, where it could catch what little warmth the winter sun might offer. The windows were set high in the walls above the reach of any curious eye from outside. They were glazed with thick greenish glass that let in a diffuse grey light. On this day in late winter, the light was pale and watery, and it fell across the rows of trestle tables in soft slanting sheets. The tables were made of heavy oak planks, darkened by age and polished by the sleeves of countless monks who had leaned upon them over the centuries. Benches ran along both sides of each table, and at the far end of the hall on a raised platform stood the abbot's table, with a plain wooden chair and a lectern for the weekly reader. Brother Aldous entered the refectory with the others. The community moved in a slow stream of black wool habits and bowed heads. There was no jostling or hurry. Each monk knew his place and went to it without thought. Brother Aldous walked to his accustomed seat near the middle of the third table on the left side. He stood behind the bench and waited. The other monks did the same. The hall filled with the soft rustle of wool and the faint scuff of leather sandals on the flagstones. Then the abbot entered and walked to his place on the platform. He did not look at the community. He stood behind his chair and bowed his head, and the entire room bowed with him. The prayer before the meal was short and familiar. Benedicit. Bless. The response was a low murmur of voices. Dominus. The Lord. Then the abbot sat and the community sat with a single collective movement that made the benches creak softly along their entire length. The sound was like the settling of a great wooden ship. Brother Aldous sat and folded his hands on the table in front of him. The wood was cool and smooth under his palms. The servers entered from the kitchen door at the far end of the hall. They were two young lay brothers whose main duty was the care of the refectory and the kitchen. They carried between them a great iron cauldron suspended from a wooden pole. The cauldron was heavy, and they walked with slow, careful steps to keep the contents from sloshing over the rim. Steam rose from the pot in soft white billows that curled upward and vanished into the shadowed beams of the ceiling. The smell that accompanied the steam was earthy and warm. It was the smell of pottage made from dried leeks and split peas, and the last of the winter beans that had been stored in the dry larder since autumn. The first server stopped at the head of the first table. The second server tilted the cauldron and a thick stream of the pottage poured into a waiting wooden bowl. The sound was a soft glugging splash that was repeated again and again as they moved down the rows. Brother Aldous watched them approach. The light from the high windows caught the steam and made it glow faintly. The servers reached his table, and he picked up his bowl and held it out. The pottage flowed into the bowl in a thick brownish-green stream. It was not an elegant food. It was a food of subsistence made from whatever the garden and the stores could provide in the lean months of the year. But it was hot, and it was filling, and the smell of it made his stomach tighten with a sharp pang of hunger. The second server followed behind the first with a large wicker basket filled with coarse brown bread. The loaves were round and flat, and they had been baked that morning in the great stone oven behind the kitchen. The crust was dark and hard and cracked in places where the dough had split during the baking. The server placed a piece of bread on the corner of each monk's table space. The bread was not cut with a knife. It was torn by hand into rough chunks. Brother Aldous took his piece and felt the warmth still lingering in the crust. The bread was heavy and dense, and it smelled of rye and barley and the faint sourness of the leavening. When all the bowls had been filled and all the bread had been distributed, the servers retreated to the kitchen door and stood there with their hands tucked into their sleeves. The reader for the week rose from his place at the abbot's table and walked to the lectern. He was a young monk with a thin face and a voice that had not yet settled into the deeper register of middle age. He opened the book that lay on the lectern. It was the Rule of Saint Benedict. The pages were worn and soft from daily handling, and the young monk turned them with a careful reverence. He found his place and began to read. The voice was flat and uninflected. It was not a voice that sought to interpret or dramatize the text. It was a voice that simply delivered the words one after another in a steady monotone that was intended to provide a background to the meal rather than to command attention. The Latin syllables rose and fell in a soft rhythm that was almost hypnotic. To genere monachorum. Concerning the kinds of monks. The words washed over the hall like a gentle rain. Brother Aldous listened without listening. The sound was familiar and comforting, a part of the daily rhythm, as natural as the bell or the cold or the weight of the habit on his shoulders. He picked up his wooden spoon. The spoon was carved from a single piece of beechwood, and its bowl was worn thin from years of use. He dipped it into the pottage and lifted a small amount to his lips. He blew across the surface once to cool it, and then took the spoon into his mouth. The pottage was hot and thick, and it tasted of earth and salt, and the faint sweetness of the leeks that had been dried the previous autumn. There were bits of bean in it that had softened during the long cooking, and they dissolved on his tongue with a mealy texture. He chewed slowly. The only sounds in the refectory were the voice of the reader and the soft clink of wooden spoons against wooden bowls and the quiet, rhythmic sound of chewing. The sound of chewing in a room full of 40 men eating in silence is a peculiar thing. It is not a loud sound. It is a soft, wet sound composed of many small individual noises that blend together into a single texture. The jaw moves. The teeth meet. The food is broken down. The tongue shifts it from side to side. The throat swallows. Then the spoon dips again and the cycle repeats. Brother Aldous was aware of his own chewing as a small private rhythm inside his head. He was also aware of the chewing of the men around him as a kind of soft chorus. Brother Paul the armorier sat to his left eating his pottage with a slow methodical motion that spoke of tired jaws and old teeth. Brother Martin the cellarer sat across the table, his broad face bent low over his bowl, his jaws working steadily. No one spoke. No one looked up. The rule of silence during meals was observed with the same quiet discipline as every other rule. Brother Aldous tore a piece from his bread and dipped it into the pottage. The crust softened and absorbed the liquid, and he lifted it to his mouth. The bread was chewy and dense, and it required more work from his jaws than the pottage. He chewed, and the flavor of the rye mingled with the leek and the bean. He swallowed, and the warm lump traveled down his throat and settled in his stomach. The hollow ache that had been there since the morning began to ease. He took another spoonful of pottage and repeated the slow, careful process of cooling and tasting and chewing and swallowing. The reader turned a page. The soft rustle of the vellum was audible in the quiet hall. The voice continued, "Dear Bede, concerning the abbot." Concerning the abbot, the words describe the qualities that an abbot should possess. He should be wise and patient and just. He should rule his community with the firmness of a father and the gentleness of a mother. He should remember that he would one day give an account of his stewardship to God. The young monk read these words in the same flat, unemphatic tone with which he had read the previous chapter. The words were important, but the voice did not treat them as important. It treated them as simply the next thing to be read. Brother Aldous looked up from his bowl for a moment. The light from the high windows had shifted slightly as the sun moved behind the clouds. The pale grey illumination fell across the rows of black habits and bent heads. The steam from the pottage had thinned now that the bowls were cooling. The air in the refectory was warm compared to the scriptorium or the church. The heat of 40 bodies and the residual warmth of the kitchen fires had raised the temperature enough that the cold no longer bit at the fingers and the face. Brother Aldous could feel the warmth seeping into his bones. His eyelids grew heavy. The combination of the hot food and the warm air and the steady monotone of the reader was a powerful inducement to sleep. He blinked slowly and returned his gaze to his bowl. He had been hungry, but the pottage was filling. The bowl was deep and the portion was generous by the standards of the winter months. He ate more slowly now, taking smaller spoonfuls and chewing longer. The bread was almost gone. He had torn it into small pieces and used each piece to soak up the last of the liquid from the bottom of the bowl. The crust had softened, and the dense crumb had absorbed the flavors of the pottage. He chewed the final piece and swallowed, and then set the wooden spoon down in the empty bowl. The reader was still reading. The voice had not changed in pitch or pace. The Septuaginta, concerning the 70. The chapter described the rotation of readers and servers for the week. Brother Aldous let the words flow over him without grasping their meaning. His stomach was full and warm. The bench beneath him was hard, but he had grown accustomed to its hardness over the years, and it no longer caused him discomfort. His hands rested on the table in front of him, one palm laid over the back of the other. He could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart in his chest and the even slower rise and fall of his breath. Around him the other monks were finishing their meals. The soft sounds of chewing had diminished and been replaced by the quiet clink of spoons being set down in empty bowls. A few of the older monks sat with their eyes closed, their heads slightly bowed. They were not sleeping. They were resting in the warmth and the silence, while the reader's voice provided a gentle barrier against the intrusion of any other thought. Brother Paul beside him had finished his pottage and was now sitting with his hands folded on the table. His breathing slow and deep. His eyes were open, but they were fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, and they did not blink often. The abbot sat at his table on the raised platform. His bowl was empty, and his bread was gone. He sat with his back straight and his hands resting on the arms of his chair. His face was impassive. He listened to the reading with the same patient attention that he gave to everything. When the reader finished the chapter and paused to turn the page, the abbot raised one hand. The reader stopped and looked up. The abbot nodded once. The meal was over. The reader closed the book, carefully aligning the pages and fastening the leather clasp. He stepped down from the lectern and returned to his place. The abbot rose, and the community rose with him in a single rustling movement. The prayer after the meal was as short as the prayer before it. Gratias agimus tibi, we give thanks to you. The response was a low murmur. Dio gratias, thanks be to God. Then the monks filed out of the refectory in the same slow, orderly stream with which they had entered. Brother Aldous walked out into the cloister walk. The air outside the refectory was immediately colder, and the warmth of the meal began to fade from his skin. He pulled his cowl up over his head and tucked his hands into his sleeves. The light in the cloister was the same pale grey winter light that had filled the refectory windows. The garden in the centre of the cloister was bare and brown. The rose bushes had been cut back to stubs, and the herb beds were covered with a layer of straw to protect them from the frost. A single robin sat on the edge of the stone well in the centre of the garden. It watched the monks pass with a bright black eye, and then flew away into the grey sky. The community dispersed to their various afternoon duties. Some went to the scriptorium to continue the work of copying. Some went to the workshops where the monastery's tools and furnishings were made and repaired. Some went to the stables or the barn or the gardens to tend to the practical needs of the community. Brother Aldous walked toward the warming room. His assigned task for the afternoon was the turning of the hay in the loft above the stables. But the hay would not need turning for another hour. In the meantime, he would sit by the fire in the warming room and let the heavy warmth of the meal settle in his stomach. The warming room was a small chamber off the cloister walk near the kitchen. It was the only room in the monastery aside from the kitchen itself where a fire was kept burning during the winter days. A large hearth dominated one wall, and a fire of beech logs crackled and hissed behind an iron screen. The room was not large enough to hold the entire community at once, but it was available to anyone who needed to warm their hands or dry their sandals or simply sit for a while in the presence of heat. Brother Aldous entered and found a place on a low wooden bench against the wall. 2 other monks were already there. One was an elderly brother who spent most of his days in the warming room now that his legs could no longer manage the long hours of standing in the choir. The other was a young novice who had been assigned to chop wood for the kitchen and had come in to warm his hands before returning to the woodpile. Brother Aldous sat down and leaned his back against the stone wall. The wall was warm from the fire on the other side of the room. The heat radiated through the stone in a slow, gentle wave. He closed his eyes. The sounds of the warming room were soft and few. The crackle of the fire, the slow breathing of the elderly monk who had fallen into a light doze, the distant thud of the novice's axe from the woodpile outside. The warmth pressed against his face and hands and seeped through the wool of his habit. His stomach was full. His body was tired from the long night and the morning's work. The heavy weight of sleep pulled at his eyelids and he let them fall. He did not sleep deeply. It was the kind of half-sleep that comes after a midday meal in winter when the body is warm and the mind is quiet, and there is nothing that requires immediate attention. He was aware of the fire and the breathing of the other monks and the distant sounds of the monastery going about its afternoon business. But he was also aware of a deeper stillness inside himself, a place where there were no words and no tasks and no thoughts. He rested there for a while, letting the warmth soak into his bones. When he opened his eyes again, the light in the warming room had changed. It was a little dimmer than before, and the shadows in the corners had deepened. The elderly monk was still dozing on his bench. The novice had gone back to his woodpile. Brother Aldous sat up and rubbed his face with his hands. The warmth of the fire had loosened the stiffness in his fingers. He flexed them slowly, feeling the joints move without pain. It was time to go to the hayloft. The afternoon work was waiting, and after the afternoon work there would be vespers, and then the evening meal, and then compline, and then the long sleep of the night. The rhythm of the day continued without pause. He rose from the bench and walked out of the warming room into the cold cloister walk. The meal was over, but its warmth stayed with him. A small core of comfort that would carry him through the remaining hours of daylight. The hayloft above the stables was a long narrow space under the peak of a roof supported by rough-hewn beams. Brother Aldous climbed the wooden ladder with slow, careful steps, feeling the rungs flex slightly under his weight. The ladder was old, and the wood was smooth where countless hands had gripped it over the years. He emerged into the loft and stood for a moment with his head bent to avoid the low rafters. The air was cold and dry, and it smelled of dust and dried grass and the faint ammonia of the horses that stamped and snorted in their stalls below. Thin shafts of grey winter light came through the gaps between the roof tiles and fell across the piled hay in long, pale stripes. The hay had been cut the previous summer from the meadow beyond the monastery's eastern wall. It was a mix of dried grasses and clover and wildflowers, all faded now to a uniform pale brown. It was piled in a great loose mound that filled most of the loft. The purpose of turning the hay was to prevent it from heating and rotting from within. Hay that was left undisturbed for too long could develop pockets of warmth where the slow decay of the plant matter generated enough heat to smoulder and sometimes even to catch fire. The turning was a simple task. Brother Aldous picked up a wooden pitchfork that leaned against the wall and began to work. He pushed the tines of the fork into the side of the pile and lifted a loose mass of dried stems. The hay rustled and crackled as it separated. He turned the fork and let the hay fall back onto the pile in a different place. The motion was repetitive and required no thought. Lift, turn, release. Lift, turn, release. The dust rose in small clouds that caught the light and drifted slowly toward the roof. He worked his way along the side of the pile, moving the outer layer to the center and bringing the inner hay to the surface. The work was not heavy, but it was steady, and it warmed his muscles after the long stillness of the morning in the scriptorium. His breath formed small white plumes in the cold air of the loft. After perhaps an hour, he stopped and leaned the pitchfork against the wall. The pile had been thoroughly turned, and the hay was loose and airy. He brushed the dust and the small fragments of stem from his habit with slow sweeps of his hands. The wool was dark and did not show the dirt, but he could feel the grit against his palms. He climbed back down the ladder and stepped out into the stable yard. The grey sky had not changed. The light was the same flat, diffuse illumination that had filled the refectory and the cloister walk. He could not have said what hour it was, but the bells would tell him when the time came. He did not return immediately to the scriptorium. The afternoon light in winter was poor for copying. The high windows of the scriptorium faced east, and by the middle of the afternoon the sun had moved far to the west, leaving the room in a dim grey twilight that strained the eyes and made the fine distinctions between similar letters difficult to discern. The rule of the scriptorium was that copying should only be done in good light to protect the accuracy of the work and the health of the scribe's vision, so the afternoon hours were given to other tasks. Brother Aldous walked across the yard toward the kitchen. The kitchen was a separate building, attached to the south side of the refectory by a short covered passage. It was built of the same grey stone as the rest of the monastery, but its roof was lower and its chimney was taller. A thin stream of pale smoke rose from the chimney and was immediately flattened and dispersed by the cold wind. The door to the kitchen was heavy oak, and it stood slightly ajar. A warm draught spilled out through the gap, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke, and simmering broth, and something sweet, that might have been honey or dried fruit. Brother Aldous pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the kitchen was the first thing he noticed. It was not a gentle warmth like the warming room. It was a thick, heavy warmth that seemed to press against his cold cheeks and hands. The air was humid, and it smelled of many things layered one upon another. Wood smoke from the great hearth. The earthy scent of root vegetables stored in bins along the wall. The sharp green smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The yeasty sourness of the bread dough that was rising in a large wooden trough near the hearth. And underneath all of these, the clean animal smell of the roasting meat that turned slowly on a spit over the fire. The kitchen was a large square room with a high ceiling crossed by heavy oak beams. From these beams hung an assortment of objects. Iron hooks held cured hams wrapped in linen. Bundles of dried sage and rosemary and thyme and bay hung upside down, tied with hemp twine. Strings of onions and garlic dangled like strange brown necklaces, and in one corner near the hearth, a large copper cauldron hung from an iron chain suspended over the flames. The cauldron was the source of the steam that filled the upper part of the room with a soft white haze. Brother Aldous could see the surface of the liquid inside the cauldron. It was a rich brown broth that trembled and shimmered with the heat from below. Small bubbles rose slowly from the depths and broke on the surface with a soft plopping sound. The kitchen was not empty. Brother Edmund, the kitchener, was a round man with a red face and hands that were always covered in flour or grease or both. He moved around the kitchen with a slow, unhurried economy, tending to the many pots and pans and fires that were his responsibility. He did not speak when Brother Aldous entered. He glanced up and nodded once and then returned his attention to the large stone mortar, where he was grinding something with a heavy pestle. The sound of the grinding was a low, rhythmic thud that blended with the crackle of the fire and the bubble of the broth. Brother Aldous found a low stool near the hearth and sat down. The warmth of the fire was intense on his face and hands. He stretched his fingers toward the flames and felt the stiffness of the cold slowly release its grip. The joints of his knuckles ached less when they were warm. He turned his hands over and over, letting the heat reach every surface. The skin of his palms was dry and cracked from the winter air and from the constant handling of parchment and ink and pumice. The warmth soothed the cracks and made the skin feel more supple. The turning spit was a marvel of simple mechanics. It was a long iron rod that passed through the center of a large joint of meat. Brother Aldous did not know what kind of meat it was. It might have been beef from the monastery's own herd, or mutton from the flocks that grazed the hills, or even venison given by a local lord in exchange for prayers. The meat was brown and glistening, and fat dripped from it in slow, heavy drops that fell into a shallow iron pan placed beneath. Each drop made a soft hiss as it hit the hot metal. The spit turned slowly, driven by a system of ropes and pulleys connected to a large wooden wheel mounted on the wall. The wheel was turned by a small dog. The dog was a rough-coated terrier of some kind, with wiry grey fur and ears that flopped forward over its eyes. It walked inside the wheel with a slow, steady gait, its claws clicking softly against the wooden slats. It did not seem to mind the work. It walked, and the wheel turned, and the ropes pulled, and the spit rotated. The dog's eyes were half closed, and its tongue lolled slightly from the side of its mouth. It had been doing this work for years, and it had learned to do it in a state of calm acceptance that was not so different from the state Brother Aldous brought to his own work. The dog walked. The spit turned. The meat roasted. The fat dripped. The fire crackled. It was a small closed system of cause and effect that required no intervention and produced a reliable result. Brother Aldous watched the dog for a while. The motion of the wheel was hypnotic. The click of the claws on the wood was a soft, regular sound like a slow heartbeat. The dog did not look at him. It did not look at anything. Its world had narrowed to the wooden slats under its feet and the steady rhythm of its own movement. Brother Aldous understood this state of being. It was the same state he entered when he copied a long passage of Celsus. The mind narrowed to the task, and the task became the whole world. There was a deep peace in it. He looked away from the dog and up toward the rafters. The ceiling of the kitchen was dark with the accumulated soot of many years. The smoke from the hearth rose in a lazy column and spread out across the underside of the roof before finding its way to the chimney. The soot had built up in layers, forming a thick velvety black coating that softened the edges of the beams and made the ceiling seem higher than it was. In places where the smoke was thickest, the soot had formed small stalactites of greasy black carbon that hung down like tiny icicles. Brother Aldous watched a single flake of soot detach from one of these formations and drift slowly downward. It spun and wobbled in the warm air currents and finally came to rest on the stone floor, where it joined the general fine dust that covered everything. The dried herbs hanging from the rafters swayed gently in the warm updraft from the fire. The bundles were tied with hemp twine and hung upside down, so that the essential oils would drain down into the leaves rather than collecting in the stems. Brother Aldous could identify some of them by their shapes and colors, even in the dim light of the kitchen. The sage bundles were soft and grey-green with broad leaves that had curled inward as they dried. The rosemary had narrow, needle-like leaves that were stiff and dark green even in their dried state. The thyme was a tangle of tiny leaves on thin, woody stems. The bay was the easiest to recognize because its leaves were large and flat and a deep olive green. These herbs would be used throughout the winter to flavor the pottage and the broths and the occasional roasted meat. Some of them would also go to the infirmarian who used them in his remedies. Sage for the throat, rosemary for the memory, thyme for the chest, bay for the digestion. The herbs hung in their quiet rows and waited for the hands that would need them. Brother Edmund finished his grinding and came to stand near the hearth. He lifted the lid of a small iron pot that sat on a trivet at the edge of the fire. A puff of steam rose and carried with it the smell of something sweet and spiced. He stirred the contents with a long wooden spoon and then replaced the lid. He did not speak. The kitchen was a place of work, and the work did not require words. Brother Aldous remained on his stool with his hands extended toward the warmth. The fire crackled. The broth bubbled. The dog walked. The spit turned. The herbs swayed. The soot drifted. After a time, Brother Aldous rose from the stool. The warmth had soaked into his bones and the stiffness had left his hands. He walked to the far side of the kitchen where a long wooden rack was fixed to the wall. This was the herbal drying rack used in summer and autumn to dry the fresh herbs brought in from the garden. In winter it stood mostly empty, but a few things still occupied its slatted shelves. There was a small pile of rose hips, shriveled and dark red, waiting to be made into a tea for the infirmarian. There was a bundle of chamomile flowers, pale yellow and faded, and there was a flat basket filled with the thin papery slices of dried apples from the orchard. Brother Aldous reached out and touched one of the apple slices. It was dry and leathery, and it bent under his finger without breaking. The smell of it was faint but sweet, a distant memory of autumn in the cold of winter. He stood at the drying rack for a while, letting his eyes move slowly over the quiet collection of preserved things. The kitchen was a place of transformation. Raw ingredients came in from the garden and the field and the forest and were changed by heat and time and skill into something that could sustain life through the dark months. The dried herbs and the salted meat and the stored roots and the fermented dough were all forms of time made edible. They were the summer and the autumn captured and held against the winter's hunger. Brother Aldous thought about the manuscript of Celsus waiting on his desk in the scriptorium. It was another kind of preservation, words instead of food, knowledge instead of sustenance. But the impulse was the same, to save what was valuable from the erosion of time and make it available for those who would come after. He turned away from the drying rack and walked back across the kitchen. The warmth had made him drowsy, and his movements were slow and heavy. He paused near the door and looked back at the room. Brother Edmund was now kneading dough on a floured board, his thick arms working with a steady rhythm. The dog still walked in its wheel. The spit still turned. The broth still bubbled. The herbs still swayed. Nothing had changed, and nothing would change. The kitchen would continue in its slow, timeless round of work until the evening meal, and then it would be cleaned and banked for the night, and then the next day it would begin again. Brother Aldous pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold. The shock of the winter air was immediate and sharp. The warmth of the kitchen fell away from him like a dropped cloak. He pulled his cowl up and tucked his hands into his sleeves and began to walk back toward the cloister. The grey sky was unchanged. The light was unchanged. The cold was unchanged. But inside him, there was a small core of warmth that would last for a while longer. The kitchen had done its work. He walked through the cloister walk and past the door to the scriptorium. He did not go in. The light was too poor for copying. Instead he continued to the church, where he found a place in a side chapel and sat down on a low stone bench. The church was empty and cold and silent. The only light came from the small red flame of the sanctuary lamp that burned always before the altar. Brother Aldous sat in the dimness and let the silence settle around him. His hands were warm and his stomach was still comfortable from the midday meal, and his mind was quiet. He sat without praying or thinking or doing anything at all. He simply existed in the cold stone space while the afternoon passed slowly toward evening. The bell for Vespers would ring soon. When it rang, he would rise and join the community in the choir and sing the psalms of the evening. Then there would be the light supper of bread and ale. Then Compline and the final prayers of the day. Then the long walk through the cold corridors to the dormitory. Then the heavy blankets and the deep silence of the night. And then in the small hours before dawn the bell would ring again and the whole slow cycle would begin anew. Brother Aldous sat on the stone bench and waited for the bell. The warmth of the kitchen stayed with him, a small steady glow against the cold of the church. Outside the wind moved across the frozen fields, but inside there was only the red lamp and the silence and the patient waiting of the winter afternoon. The light in the scriptorium was failing. Brother Aldous could see it happening even as he walked through the door from the cloister. The high eastern windows that had been rectangles of pale grey all afternoon were now rectangles of a deeper blue-grey, the colour of old pewter. The sun had dropped below the horizon somewhere beyond the western walls, and the long winter twilight was settling over the monastery like a slow falling dust. He crossed to his desk and looked at the page of vellum that waited under its linen cover. The work of the morning and the previous night was visible as rows of small dark letters marching down the creamy surface. But there was a space at the beginning of the passage that remained empty. It was a rectangular gap, about 2 inches square, where the first letter of the new section should have been. That letter was an H. And it was not an ordinary H. In the manuscripts produced by the scriptorium, the first letter of a major section was always decorated. It was a capital letter, larger than the text letters, and it was painted in colours that made it stand out from the black sea of the surrounding words. The decoration served a practical purpose. It marked the beginning of a new topic and allowed a reader flipping through the pages to find the start of a section quickly. But it also served a less practical purpose. It was a small act of beauty inserted into the useful work of preserving knowledge. The capital letter was a reminder that the words being copied were not just information, but something worthy of honour. The H that Brother Aldous was to paint would be blue, not the dull grey blue of woad or the pale watery blue of crushed cornflowers, but the deep brilliant blue of ultramarine. Ultramarine was the most precious of all the pigments used in the scriptorium. It was made from lapis lazuli, a stone that came from a single range of mountains in a distant land far to the east beyond the sea and beyond the desert and beyond the lands that any monk of the monastery had ever seen. The stone travelled along trade routes that stretched across the known world, passing through the hands of merchants and caravan masters and ship captains, until it reached the ports of Italy, and from there was carried over the mountains into France and England. By the time a small piece of lapis lazuli arrived at the monastery, it had cost more than its weight in gold. Brother Aldous kept the lapis lazuli in a small locked box inside the larger chest where the most valuable materials of the scriptorium were stored. The key to the box hung on a cord around his neck, tucked beneath his habit. He reached up and drew the cord out and unlocked the box. Inside, wrapped in a square of soft leather, lay a single piece of lapis lazuli. It was about the size of a walnut, and its surface was a deep, rich blue flecked with small golden specks of iron pyrite that caught the candlelight and glittered faintly. The stone was smooth and cool to the touch. He had been given this piece 3 years ago, when the previous scribe who had held the position before him grew too old to see the fine work and retired to the warming room to spend his days in prayer. The stone had been used sparingly since then, reserved only for the most important manuscripts. The De Medicina of Celsus was considered worthy. He placed the stone on the desk beside a small thick slab of polished marble that served as his grinding surface. Next to the marble, he set out a tiny glass vial containing a few drops of clear liquid. This was the gum arabic solution that would bind the pigment particles together, and beside the vial he placed a small pottery cup containing the yolk of a fresh egg, carefully separated from the white by Brother Edmund in the kitchen, and brought to the scriptorium still warm. The yolk was a deep orange color, and it trembled slightly in the cup. The grinding of lapis lazuli was a slow, patient labor. The stone was hard, and it resisted being reduced to powder. Brother Aldous picked up a small iron hammer with a flat face and tapped the stone gently until a small fragment broke away from the main piece. He set the larger piece back in its leather wrapping and returned it to the locked box. The fragment he placed on the marble slab. It was no bigger than a grain of barley. He took up the glass muller, a heavy bell-shaped tool with a flat, ground base, and began to grind. The motion was a slow circular rotation of the wrist. The muller pressed down on the fragment, and the fragment scraped against the marble with a fine, gritty sound. He added a single drop of the gum arabic solution to the marble. The liquid spread around the fragment, and the grinding sound changed, becoming wetter and softer. The clear liquid began to take on a faint blue tinge. He continued to grind. The fragment broke into smaller pieces, and then into a coarse sand, and then into a coarse sand, and then into a fine powder. The blue color deepened and intensified. The golden specks of pyrite separated from the blue and became visible as tiny bright flecks in the darkening paste. He ground the pigment for a long time. The motion was repetitive and meditative. The muller described small circles on the marble, and his hand moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm. The light from the candle flickered, and the shadows moved on the wall, but his attention was fixed on the small patch of blue that was slowly spreading across the white stone. The color was extraordinary. It was a blue that seemed to glow from within, a blue that was deeper than the sky on a summer afternoon, and richer than the petals of any flower. It was the blue of the robe of the Virgin Mary in the great altarpieces of the cathedrals. It was the blue of heaven itself, rendered in powdered stone. When the pigment was as fine as he could make it, he stopped grinding and examined the paste. He touched the tip of his little finger to the blue and rubbed it against his thumb. The pigment was smooth and silky, with no detectable grittiness. It was ready. He added another drop of gum solution to thin the paste slightly, and then he took up the cup containing the egg yolk. The yolk was the binding medium that would hold the pigment particles together and adhere them to the vellum. He used the tip of a clean quill to transfer a small amount of the yolk to the blue paste. The orange of the yolk swirled into the blue, creating a strange greenish color for a moment before the two substances blended completely. He stirred the mixture with the quill tip until the color was uniform. The ultramarine was now a thick, glossy paint ready for the brush. The brush lay waiting in a small pottery jar on the corner of his desk. It was made from the tail hairs of a red squirrel, and it was finer than anything else in the scriptorium. The hairs were soft and flexible, and they came to a perfect point that could produce a line as thin as a spider's thread. Brother Aldous had made the brush himself 2 winters ago, using techniques that had been taught to him by the old scribe who had since retired to the warming room. He lifted the brush from the jar and dipped the tip into the blue paint. The hairs absorbed the color and swelled slightly. He touched the tip to the edge of the marble to remove any excess, and then he brought the brush to the empty rectangular space on the vellum. The H was already sketched in faint lead point lines that he had drawn earlier in the day when the light was good. The Lee point was a soft metal stylus that left a pale grey mark easily covered by the paint. The outline of the H showed a tall letter with 2 vertical stems and a horizontal crossbar. The stems were straight and parallel. The crossbar was level and centered. The letter filled most of the rectangular space, leaving a narrow margin around the edges. Within the body of the letter there were smaller spaces that would be filled with delicate white tracery later. But for now the task was simply to lay down the solid blue ground. Brother Aldous lowered the brush until the tip just touched the vellum at the upper left corner of the first vertical stem. He began to paint. The motion was slow and controlled. The brush moved downward along the stem, leaving a smooth, even trail of brilliant blue behind it. The paint flowed from the hairs onto the burnished surface of the vellum and settled into a thin, glossy film. The color was so intense that it seemed to vibrate against the cream of the surrounding page. He reached the bottom of the stem and lifted the brush. The line was straight and the edges were crisp. He dipped the brush again and painted the second vertical stem, then the crossbar, Then he began to fill the interior spaces, working the paint into the corners where the stems met the crossbar. The work required absolute stillness. The brush was so fine that even the slight tremor of a heartbeat transmitted through the hand could cause the line to waver. Brother Aldous breathed slowly and shallowly. His chest barely moved. His hand was steady as a stone. The paint went on in thin, even layers, building up the color gradually. One coat was not enough. The ultramarine was a transparent pigment, and it needed to be laid down in multiple thin applications to achieve the full depth of its color. He painted the entire letter once and then sat back to let it dry. The drying took time. The egg-yolk binder dried slowly in the cold air of the scriptorium, and the surface of the paint lost its wet gleam gradually from the edges inward. While the first coat dried, Brother Aldous cleaned the brush. He dipped it in a small cup of water and swirled it gently, and then pressed the hairs against a scrap of linen to draw out the color. The water turned a pale, milky blue. He repeated the process until the brush ran clear, and then he shaped the tip with his lips and set it back in the pottery jar. The brush would be needed again when the first coat was dry. He waited. The candle burned steadily at his left shoulder. The flame was reflected in the surface of the still wet paint as a tiny golden point that moved slightly as the liquid settled. Outside the high windows, the last of the twilight had faded, and the world was now fully dark. The scriptorium was a cave of shadows, with only the single candle to hold back the night. Brother Aldous sat with his hands folded on the desk and watched the paint dry. The blue grew deeper and richer as the water evaporated and the egg yolk hardened. The color that had been brilliant when wet became something else when dry. It became dense and velvety, a blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It was the color of the deep ocean or the sky at the last moment before true night. When the first coat was dry to the touch, he took up the brush again and applied the second coat. The process was identical to the first. The same slow, careful strokes. The same shallow breathing. The same steady hand. The second coat deepened the color further and smoothed out any slight unevenness in the first layer. He painted the stems and the crossbar and the interior spaces with the same patient attention. Then he set the brush down and waited for the second coat to dry. The waiting was a kind of work in itself. It was the work of patience and of trust that the materials would do what they were meant to do. The egg yolk would harden. The pigment would bond to the vellum. The color would last for centuries. Brother Aldous did not fidget or look around the room. He sat still and watched the blue letter slowly transform from a wet, glossy surface to a dry, velvety one. The candle flame leaned in a draught and then straightened. The shadows on the wall shifted and settled. The silence of the scriptorium was complete. When the second coat was dry, he applied a third. The third coat was the final one. It brought the color to its full depth and richness. The H now glowed on the page like a small window into another world. The blue was so intense that it made the surrounding black text seem pale and grey by comparison. Brother Aldous examined the letter carefully, turning his head to catch the light from different angles. The surface was smooth and even. The edges were crisp and clean. The color was uniform throughout. It was good work. It was the kind of work that would outlast him and the abbot and everyone else currently living within the monastery walls. He cleaned the brush one final time and set it in the jar. The remaining ultramarine paint on the marble slab he covered with a small upturned cup to keep it from drying out. There was enough left for perhaps one more small initial if it was needed. The tools were wiped and put away. The locked box was returned to the chest. The key was tucked back beneath his habit. The H sat on the page complete and perfect. Tomorrow or the next day, one of the other monks who specialized in the fine white tracery would add the delicate vine work and the small gold leaf details that would transform the simple blue letter into a fully illuminated initial. But the heart of the illumination was already there. The deep, brilliant blue of the ultramarine was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. Brother Aldous looked at the letter for a long moment. It was a small thing. It was only a single letter on a single page in a single manuscript, but it was also a piece of the great chain of preservation that stretched back to the ancient world and forward into a future that he would never see. The blue of the lapis lazuli had traveled across mountains and deserts and seas to arrive at this desk in this monastery on this winter night. And now it would remain on this page for as long as the vellum and the binding and the library survived. The candle was burning low, the pool of tallow was deep, and the wick was beginning to bend. Brother Aldous placed the linen cover over the page, protecting the still fragile paint from dust. He set the 2 river stones on the corners to hold the vellum flat. The manuscript of Kessus lay open on its stand, and he closed it gently, aligning the pages and fastening the iron clasp. He carried it to the shelf and slid it into its place among the other medical texts. The scriptorium was tidy and ready for the next day's work. He stood for a moment in the center of the room. The candle in his hand was the only light. Its flame was small and steady, and he pushed back the darkness just enough to show the shapes of the desks and the shelves and the high vaulted ceiling. The cold was deep now that the night had fully settled in. He could feel it pressing against his face and seeping through the wall of his habit. It was time to return to the dormitory. The bell for Compline had rung while he was painting, and the community had sung the final psalms of the day without him. The abbot had given him permission to work through the evening office, when the light was just enough for the fine brushwork. But now the work was done, and the night was claiming the monastery. Brother Aldous walked to the door and paused. He looked back at his desk. The covered page waited under its stones. The blue clothed his memory, even though he could not see it. He would return in the morning when the grey winter light crept through the high eastern windows. The work would continue. The next page, and the next letter, and the next passage of Celsus. The slow, patient accumulation of words on vellum. The preservation of knowledge against the erosion of time. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was a whole life contained in the small space between the candle and the page. He stepped through the archway and into the cold corridor. The flame of his candle streamed behind him as he walked. The stones of the floor were worn smooth by centuries of sandals. The walls were rough plaster shadowed and silent. He walked slowly through the dark passages of the sleeping monastery toward the dormitory where his bed and his blanket waited. The bell would ring again before dawn. The rhythm would begin again, but for now there was only the cold and the dark and the soft sound of his own footsteps carrying him toward rest. The last page of the evening had been turned, and the last word of Celsus had been set down in its proper place. Brother Aldous sat for a moment longer on his polished stool, looking at the fresh lines of text that now covered the vellum. The ink was still wet in places, and it gleamed softly in the candlelight, with a faint gloss that would fade as it dried. The letters were small and even and well spaced. The margins were straight. The blue H glowed from its place at the beginning of the section like a small piece of captured sky. The work of the day and the night and the long quiet hours in between was complete. There would be more work tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. But for now the task was finished. He reached for the square of clean linen that lay folded at the corner of his desk. The cloth was soft from many washings, and it smelled faintly of the lavender that had been packed with it in the storage chest. He unfolded it and laid it gently over the written page, covering the words and the blue initial and the empty spaces that waited for the next day's labor. The linen settled onto the vellum with a soft sigh of displaced air. He smoothed it flat with the palm of his hand, feeling the slight texture of the writing beneath the cloth. The page was protected now from dust and from the accidental drip of tallow or water that might fall during the night. The 2 smooth river stones sat on the desk where they had been all through the long hours of copying. He picked them up, one in each hand. They were cool and heavy, and their surfaces were worn to a soft polish by the stream that had shaped them. He placed them on the corners of the linen cover, where they would hold the vellum flat against the natural tendency of the skin to curl and warp as the humidity of the night air changed. The stones made a small dull sound as they settled into place. A sound that was final and satisfying, like the closing of a door. Next, he turned his attention to the quill. The nib was still darkened with ink, and the slit was clogged with the dried residue of the last few strokes. He took the square of waste vellum that he kept for cleaning and wiped the nib, carefully drawing the point across the scrap several times until no more color transferred. The ink left faint grey smears on the scrap that would dry to a dull black by morning. Then he dipped the nib into the small cup of water that sat at the back of his desk. The water was cold, and it had been sitting there since the afternoon. He swirled the quill gently, and watched as a thin cloud of darkness bled from the slit into the water. He wiped the nib again on the scrap, and repeated the process until the water remained clear and the quill was clean. The clean quill was still damp. He set it aside on the linen rest to dry overnight. By morning the shaft would be stiff and ready for use again. The other quills on his desk, the ones he had not used during this session, were already clean and dry. He gathered them together and placed them in the shallow groove that ran along the front edge of his writing slope. They lay there in a neat row, their nibs pointing toward the left, their feather ends toward the right. They were ready for the next day. The ink in the stone mortar had been used sparingly, and there was still a small amount remaining at the bottom. It would not keep until morning. Oak gall ink, made with rainwater and gum arabic, would spoil if left exposed to the air for too long. The surface would grow a thin skin of mold, and the liquid beneath would turn sour and thin. Brother Aldous picked up the mortar and carried it to the small alcove in the corner of the scriptorium where a covered jar stood for waste ink. The jar was made of coarse earthenware with a heavy lid. He removed the lid and poured the remaining ink into the jar. The black liquid fell in a thin stream and splashed softly against the inside of the vessel. He tipped the mortar to let the last drops fall and then set it back on his desk. The mortar was still stained with a dark residue that clung to the stone. He took a scrap of waste vellum and wiped the interior of the mortar as clean as he could. The scrap came away black, and he dropped it into the niche under his desk with the other used scraps that would eventually go to the kitchen for lighting fires. Then he carried the mortar to the buttery where the oak galls and the gum arabic and the rainwater cistern waited in the darkness. He placed the mortar on its shelf and stood for a moment in the cold, small room. The air smelled of old tannin and damp stone. He would need to crush more galls before the next batch of ink, but that was a task for another night. When he returned to his desk, the scriptorium seemed larger and emptier than it had been. The candle on his desk was now the only light in the entire eastern range of the monastery. Brother Paul the Armarius had retired hours ago, and his corner of the room was a pool of absolute darkness. The high windows were black rectangles that gave back no reflection. The only sound was the soft hiss of the candle flame and the distant settling of the stone building as the night cold tightened its grip on the masonry. Brother Aldous stood beside his desk and looked at the covered page and the waiting quills and the closed book of Telsus on its stand. Everything was in order. The de Medicina exemplar needed to be returned to its place. He lifted the heavy volume from the book stand. The oak boards were smooth and cool under his hands, and the iron clasp was cold. He carried the book to the shelf on the north wall where the medical texts were kept. The shelf was in deep shadow, and he had to find the place by touch, running his fingers along the spines of the other volumes. He felt the familiar shape of Galen and the worn leather of Avicenna, and the slim pamphlet of herbal remedies that the infirmarian consulted. He slid the Celsus into the gap between Galen and a collection of surgical notes. The book settled into place with a soft thud. He returned to his desk and looked at the candle. It had burned down to a stub no taller than his thumb. No taller than his thumb. The pool of melted tallow around the wick was deep, and the flame was beginning to gutter as it consumed the last of the fuel. It was time to snuff the light. He reached into the niche under his desk and withdrew the small brass cone that was kept for this purpose. The cone was attached to a slender wooden handle, and its interior was blackened with the soot of many extinguished flames. He held the cone over the candle for a moment, watching the flame dance in the slight draught of his movement. Then he lowered the cone gently until it covered the wick completely. The flame did not go out immediately. There was a brief moment when the light continued to glow through the thin brass, casting a faint orange translucence. Then the oxygen inside the cone was consumed, and the flame died. A thin stream of pale smoke rose from the top of the cone and curled upward into the darkness of the vaulted ceiling. The smoke was white at first, and then it grew thinner and more transparent until it was just a faint disturbance in the air. It rose, and then it was gone, vanishing into the high shadows where the beams and the plaster met. The smell of the extinguished wick was sharp and waxy, and it hung in the air for a moment before the cold draught from the windows carried it away. The scriptorium was now completely dark. There was no light at all. Dark. There was no light at all. Not the faint red glow of the sanctuary lamp from the church. Not the distant glimmer of a star through the high windows. The darkness was absolute, and it pressed against his eyes like a soft weight. Brother Aldous stood in the darkness for a while, letting his eyes adjust. They did not adjust. There was nothing to adjust to. The darkness was complete. He knew the layout of the room well enough to walk through it without sight. He had done it many times before. The desk was 2 paces behind him. The door was 12 paces ahead and slightly to the left. The floor was smooth and even. He began to walk. His sandals made a soft sound on the stone flags, a quiet scuff that was the only noise in the vast silent room. He counted the paces without thinking. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. His hand reached out and touched the edge of a desk that was not his own. He adjusted his path slightly. 5 and 6 and 7. His fingers brushed the rough plaster of the wall. 8 and 9 and 10. The wall ended, and his hand found the smooth dressed stone of the door frame. 11 and 12. He stepped through the archway and into the corridor beyond. The corridor was as dark as the scriptorium, but the air was different. It was colder here, and it moved with a slow draught that carried the smell of the cloister garden and the faint mustiness of the church. Brother Aldous turned left and began the long walk toward the dormitory. The passage was straight, and he knew every step of it. His right hand trailed along the wall, feeling the familiar landmarks. The rough patch of plaster where a repair had been made decades ago. The smooth section of original stonework. The shallow niche where a small statue of St. Benedict stood in the darkness. The wooden door of the warming room, now closed and silent. The archway that led to the cloister walk. He passed them all in the darkness without seeing them. His footsteps were the only sound. They echoed softly in the narrow passage, a quiet rhythm that was slow and unhurried. He was not tired in the way of a man who has worked a long day. He was tired in the deeper way of a man who has been awake through the small hours of the night, and who has given his attention fully to a single task for many hours. It was a good tiredness. It was the tiredness of completion. His body was heavy and his mind was quiet, and all he wanted now was the hard mattress of his bed and the weight of the woolen blankets. He reached the foot of the spiral staircase that led up to the dormitory. The stairs were narrow and worn, and they curved tightly to the left. He began to climb, placing each foot carefully on the uneven steps. The wall was close on his right side, and his shoulder brushed against it with each step. The stone was cold and slightly damp. He climbed slowly, and his breathing deepened with the effort. The staircase seemed longer in the dark than it did during the day, when the faint light from the dormitory above filtered down. But he knew it was only 23 steps. He had counted them many times. He counted them now in his mind. 17 and 18 and 19. The air grew slightly warmer as he ascended. 20 and 21 and 22. His head rose above the level of the floor, and he felt the open space of the dormitory around him. 23. He stepped off the last stair and onto the wooden floorboards. The dormitory was a long, low room, with a row of beds along each wall. The beds were simple wooden frames with straw mattresses covered in coarse linen. Each bed had 2 wool blankets folded at the foot. There were no curtains or screens. The monks slept in the same open room where they had slept for centuries. The air in the dormitory was still, and it smelled of wool and straw, and the faint clean scent of the rushes that were scattered on the floor. A single oil lamp burned at the far end of the room near the door to the abbot's chamber. Its flame was turned down low, and it cast a dim orange glow that barely reached the center of the room. Brother Aldous walked down the center aisle between the rows of beds. The other monks were already asleep. He could hear their breathing in the darkness. Some of them breathed deeply and slowly, with a low rumbling sound that came from the back of the throat. Others breathed lightly and quickly, almost silently. One of the older monks had a slight wheeze that rose and fell with each breath. The sounds blended together into a soft human music that filled the dormitory. Brother Aldous found his own bed. It was the third from the end on the left side. He knew it by its position and by the small wooden cross that hung on the wall above it. He sat down on the edge of the bed. The straw mattress crunched softly under his weight. He reached down and removed his sandals one at a time, placing them on the floor beside the bed where he could find them in the dark when the bell rang for vigils. His feet were cold, and the wooden floor was colder. He swung his legs up onto the mattress and lay back. The straw shifted and settled around him, molding itself to the shape of his body. He pulled the 2 wool blankets up to his chin. They were heavy and rough, and they smelled faintly of the lanolin that remained in the wool. The ceiling of the dormitory was lost in darkness, but he knew it was there. He had looked at it many times while lying in this bed, waiting for sleep to come. The beams were old and dark, and they had been shaped by adzes that were wielded by men who had been dead for hundreds of years. The plaster between the beams was cracked in places, and the cracks formed patterns that his mind had learned to recognize. A shape like a fish near the window, a shape like a hand near the door. He could not see them now, but he knew they were there above him in the dark. He closed his eyes. The sounds of the dormitory settled around him, the breathing of the other monks, the faint creak of a bed frame as someone shifted in their sleep, the distant tick of the cooling stone in the walls, the soft rustle of the rushes as a mouse moved through them in search of crumbs. These were the sounds of the night, and they were as familiar to him as the sound of his own heartbeat. His mind drifted back over the hours that had passed since the bell before dawn had called him from this same bed. The cold corridor and the dark church and the low murmur of vigils, the crushing of the oak galls and the mixing of the ink, the pouncing of the vellum and the burnishing of the surface, the cutting of the quill and the testing of the nib, the slow copying of the quill and the consultation of the glossary, the visit of the abbot and the question about the spelling of a name, the midday meal and the sound of cheering in the silent refectory, the warmth of the kitchen and the turning of the spit dog on its wheel, the grinding of the lapis lazuli and the painting of the blue aetius, and finally the cleaning of the tools and the closing of the book and the snuffing of the candle. All of it was a single continuous movement, a single day in a life made of such days. He did not think about tomorrow. Tomorrow would come and it would bring its own tasks. There would be more pages of Celsus to copy. There would be more quills to cut and more ink to mix. There would be prayers in the choir and meals in the refectory and the slow turning of the hours from dawn to dusk to darkness again. The rhythm would continue as it had continued for all the years of his life in the monastery. It was a good rhythm. It was a rhythm that held a man and carried him forward without asking him to decide where to go. His breathing slowed and deepened. The weight of the blankets pressed him down into the straw mattress. The cold that had been in his feet and hands all night began to fade, replaced by the slow warmth of his own body trapped beneath the wool. The sounds of the dormitory grew distant and soft, as if they were coming from a room far away. The mouse in the rushes stopped its searching and settled into some hidden corner. The monk with the wheeze turned over, and his breathing became smooth and silent. The oil lamp at the far end of the room flickered once and then steadied. Brother Aldous let go of the day. He let go of the words of Celsus and the shape of the Greek letters and the precise angle of the quill. He let go of the blue H and the smell of the oak gall ink and the feel of the pumice powder on his fingertips. He let go of everything except the simple fact of lying in his bed in the dark dormitory, surrounded by the breathing of his brothers. The great silence of the monastery wrapped around him like a third blanket. Outside the walls the winter wind moved across the frozen fields and the stars turned slowly in their courses. But inside there was only the dark and the quiet and the slow drift towards sleep. The bell for vigils would ring again in a few hours. It would seep into the stone and travel down through the joints of the masonry and enter the sleeping ear, not as a call to wake, but as a simple, undeniable fact of the hour. The rhythm would begin again. The cold corridor and the dark church and the low murmur of prayer. The scriptorium and the candle and the waiting page. But for now, there was only the long, deep silence of the night. Brother Aldous breathed once more, a slow, full breath that filled his chest and then emptied out. His face relaxed, his hands uncurled on the blanket. The last faint thread of waking thought dissolved into the darkness, and he slept.